And I'm at the hour. So, well, hello everyone. Thank you for stopping by. I do so much appreciate it. So as always, I'm SkitterSkreetch. You can call me Skitter, and I still remain trapped inside this big cursed library. So, running through our usual business.
Ah, the rat!
Hello, Wild. Good to have you here. Speaking of Wild, actually, so first order of business, we got a new name to add to the board. Wild has managed to pull their I guess first, which sounds a bit oxymoronic, but yeah. So we got to add Wild Evil Woman. There we go. Bam. There we go. Welcome to the rankings, Wild. You're now locked in an eternal struggle with everyone else in that board for a bigger number. And by everyone else in that board, I of course mean Abbe, who is undisputed champion of getting there early. Yeah. What else are we doing? That's that done. Next on the agenda, no badges today. I'll probably do again like I did with the MR Jameses. I'll do a badge at the end of the old collection we got of them, which it's still going to be a while, but it'll give me more of an idea of what's going on through them, and hopefully an idea for a badge. No new follows since last stream, so I want to thank for that. Well, I am still very appreciative of it every time someone does follow. So actually, you know, I'm going to take a moment to thank all of you who have currently followed me already. Again, I genuinely appreciate it. Any other particular business? Actually, yeah, there's a new thing I think I would start doing, so I'll take a moment to do that now. But I'm going to come over here and point out to you that we've got some new books in the library today. I don't have an object to point with. If only there was some sort of central focal point I could make. Oh, I am levitating. Lamp is levitating me. Okay, I am being moved around. Okay, I guess I am showing it. So, I don't like when this happens. Okay, so as mentioned last week, we did get some more of the Emery James. There's a big old lot of them in, so they're over here. Ooh. And also last week we got some Ono de Balzac, a couple of things. I feel quite unwell. Right, so we also it's been too hot today to. Okay, Lamp, put me down for a second. Ooh, I do not like that. It's been too hot today to stay up in the higher parts of the library, so I went down to some of the deep stacks to get in some cool. Ooh, and while I was down there, I picked up a couple more books. Namely this one, which is Jason and Medea by Apollonius of Rhodes, which I think is a bit of a more classical text. And okay, over here we got some essays by Michael de Montaigne, which I think are fragments, but which we'll do at some point. And and then over here, just above me, behind me a little bit, we've got a couple of short stories by Nikolai Gogol, namely The Nose and the Carriage. Oh. Okay, let's not levitate anymore. Oh. Really don't like when he does that. Okay, so that's the new additions to the library. That's I'm gonna go lie down for a second. Ooh. But yeah, I need to get like a pointer or something for that next time. I do not like being levitated, but yeah, I thought I would take a moment to show you what we've got in the library when we get new stuff in. Which I don't get new things in every day, but I do try and keep it fairly well stocked regularly so that we don't run out of stuff. And also just sometimes it's hard for me to get out, so obviously it's good to have stuff when we can get it. But yeah, just gonna have a quick swallow. I'm feeling level. Oh, that's better. Okay. Oh, but yeah, as I mentioned a couple of places, the plan today is to carry on with the Emery Jameses. Yesterday, of course, we did our Torrid Tuesday reading of Emma by Jane Austen, but today we'll work on these three up here. I'm not sure how far we're going to get on in today. Owen Wingrave, I think, took us about 2 hours, which is reasonably long, but I don't have any plans. 2 of these are about the same length, one of them's a little shorter, so I think tentatively the plan is going to be to do one of the longer ones and then the short one, and then maybe if I'm feeling up to it, we'll do the other long one afterwards. Because, you know, why not? We'll see how we feel. Oh, but yeah, other than that, where am I going? There we are. Other than that, what is there to say about today? We're still 5 minutes past, so I've got 5 minutes that I'm supposed to fill before I'm allowed to start. Lamp. That's something I haven't actually introduced Lamp in a while, have I? I don't know if everyone knows about him, so let's go have a chat with Lamp briefly. Because I mean, technically we're doing stuff on cursed items, and Lamp is sort of a cursed item. So this is within theme. So for those of you that don't know, this is Lamp, who, in addition to being an actual physical lamp, is a magical item, being. It's a little unclear. He used to be a guy. Back when the archive was still full of wizards, Lamp was a wizard. And at some point he was murdered by another wizard and made into a lamp to help him with doing spells and research and stuff. And they took away all his memories and made him into a sort of like a computer, but made out of a human soul. And now he can think and he can't talk out loud, but he can talk in your head, which he can't do via Twitch, so I can hear him. But yeah, fair. Appreciate you being here, Wild. Thank you for stopping by, and congratulations again on first. But yeah, Lamp is so he's sort of a cursed object in the sense that he used to be a guy and is basically a modified human soul trapped inside the lamp. Now, what does Lamp do? That's a very complicated question, and I don't really know how to answer that. Because the answer is that Lamp does a lot of things. In addition to basically to being a person on account of, you know, just being a guy in there, he's very heavily tied into a lot of the functions of the library or the archive, and he also yells at me a lot whenever I call it the library, so that's why I'm correcting myself. He's also the reason that I do these book readings. He makes me. Also, he insists that he doesn't make me. He does. What he does is he's capable of conjuring food, and he's the only thing in here that can make food because there's no other food. So if I want food, I have to do the book readings and other stuff that he tells me, or I don't get any food. Which he insists is different from making me do it, even though meaningfully it does not differ in any way as far as I can tell. Also, he will only make me cheese. He can do other food. I know for a fact he can do other food because he's done it at least once, but he won't do anything but cheese. He refuses to clarify why. When you give me money, that money goes to Lamp, and I get a second different type of cheese, which is admittedly better, but is still cheese. I think I should express more often how mad I am at Lamp, just in general. Nazca was encouraging me in this. Lamp is very mean to me. But yeah, also he burns a special type of magical oil, which I don't know what that does, and he can possess my body when and as he chooses. That's another thing he's capable of. Manages many functions of the library, capable of thought and communication. You know, generally a very powerful magical item that I guess I don't know if he would qualify as cursed. I think under the archives system he wouldn't actually, because he's not an actively harmful item. But yeah, that's Lamp. I thought I'd have more to say about him really, but I don't actually. As a magical item, I don't really understand how he works. I'm being told by Lamp that I am not allowed to figure out how he works, so I guess we won't be coming out to this, but yeah, that's Lamp for anyone who's not familiar. Anyhow, that's about 10 minutes past. I've got to sleep going. Right, so we'll start moving on to tonight's reading. Let's see, which one of these was the short one? Romance of Old Clothes is the short one, so I guess we'll start with the Jolly Corner. That's the one that's, it's 29 pages rather than 30, which is how long Wingrave was. We'll start with that one, then we'll move on to Old Clothes, and then if we still feel up to it, we'll do Ghostly Red. As always, before I start, well, first things first, have a swallow of water. It's a good practice. But yeah, as always, if at any point I've skipped over something, or you've had a little bit of a technical issue, or you've missed something, or even if you just come in late, although you won't hear this if you come in late, so I don't know what I said, let me know and I'm happy to go back and repeat something. If you've got comments, questions, always happy to have a chat, that sort of thing. Yeah, and if you've got anything to say before I start, now would be the period to do it, because otherwise I'll spring into things. Yeah, other than that, unless anyone has any pressing business, then without any further ado, if you are sitting comfortably, I shall begin. The Jolly Corner. 1. Everyone asks me what I think of everything, said Spencer Bryden. I'll make answer as I can, begging or dodging the question, putting them off with any nonsense. It wouldn't matter to any of them, really, he went on, for even if it were possible to meet in that stand and deliver way so silly a demand on so big a subject as my thoughts, would still be almost altogether about something that concerns only myself. He was talking to Miss Staverton, with whom for a couple of months now he had availed himself of every possible occasion to talk. This disposition and this resource, this comfort and support, as the situation in fact presented itself, having promptly enough taken the first place in the considerable array of rather unattenuated surprises attending his so strangely belated return to America. Everything was somehow a surprise, and that might be natural when one had so long and so consistently neglected everything, taken pains to give surprise so much margin for play. He had given them more than 30 years, 33 to be exact, and they now seemed to him to have organised their performance quite on the scale of that licence. He had been 23 on leaving New York, he was 56 today, unless indeed he would have reckoned, as he had sometimes, since his repatriation, found himself feeling, in which case he would have lived longer than is often allotted to man. It would have taken a century, he repeatedly said to himself, and said also to Alice Staverton. It would have taken a longer absence and a more averted mind than those even of which it had been guilty, to pile up the differences, the newness, the queerness, above all the bigness, for the better or the worse, that at present assaulted his vision wherever he looked. The great fact all the while, however, had been the incalculability, since he had supposed himself, from decade to decade, to be allowing, and in the most liberal and intelligent manner, for brilliancy a change. He actually saw that he had allowed for nothing. He missed what he would have been sure of finding. He found what he would never have imagined. Proportions and values was upside down. The ugly things he had expected, the ugly things of his faraway youth, when he had too promptly waked up to a sense of the ugly. These uncanny phenomena placed him rather, as it happened, under the charms, whereas the swagger things, the modern, the monstrous, the famous things, those he had more particularly, like thousands of ingenious inquirers every year, come over to see, were exactly the sources of dismay. There were as so many set traps for displeasure, above all for reaction, of which his restless dread would constantly press in the spring. It were interesting, doubtless, the old show, but it would have been too disconcerting hadn't a certain finer truth saved the situation. He had distinctly not, in this steadier lark, come over all for the monstrosities. He had come, not only in the last analysis, but quite on the face of the act, under an impulse with which they had nothing to do. He had come, putting the thing pompously, to look at his property, which he had thus for a third of a century not been within 4,000 miles of. Or, expressing it less sordidly, he had yielded to the humour of seeing again his house on the Jolly Corner, as he usually and quite fondly described it, the one in which he had first seen the light, in which various members of his family had lived and had died, in which the holidays of his overschooled boyhood had been passed and the few social flowers of his child adolescence gathered, and which, alienated them for so long a period, had, through the successive deaths of his two brothers and the termination of old arrangements, come wholly into his hands. He was the owner of another, not quite so good, the Jolly Corner having been, from far back, superlatively extended and consecrated, and the value of the pair representing his main capital, with income consisting, in these latter years, of their respective rents which, thanks precisely to their original excellent start, had never been depressingly low. He could live in Europe, as he had been in the habit of living, on the product of these flourishing New York leases, and all the better, since out of the second structure, there were a number in its long row, having within a 12-month fallen in, renovating at a high advance had proved beautifully possible. These was items of property indeed, but he had found himself, since his arrival, distinguishing more than ever between them. The house with the street, 2 Bristol blocks westward, were already in course of reconstruction, in a tall mass of flats. He had acceded, some time before, to overtures for this conversion, in which, now that we're going forward, it had been not the least of his astonishment to find himself able, on the spot, and though without a previous ounce of such experience.
Ah, the rat!
Hey Abbe, good to have you. We just started with the Jolly Corner. A fella by the name of Spencer Bryden has come to New York after having lived in Europe for 33 years to look at some properties that he owns. One that he likes called the Jolly Corner, which is the house he grew up in, and one which he's not so fond of, which is currently being converted into flats. He's talked with a woman and he's complained about new things that are happening in New York. That's where we're at. I thank you for stopping by. I do genuinely appreciate it. On the spot, and though without previous ounce of such experience, to participate with a certain intelligence, almost with a certain authority. He had lived his life, with his back so turned to such concerns and his face addressed to those of so different an order, that he scarce knew what to make of this lively stir, in a compartment of his mind there yet penetrated, with a capacity for business and a sense for construction. These virtues, so common all round him now, had been dormant in his own organism, where it might be said of them, perhaps, that they had slept the sleep of the just. At present, in the splendid autumn weather, the autumn at least was a pure boon in the terrible place. Hey, Abbe. He loafed about his work undeterred, secretly agitated, not in the least minding that the old propositions, as they said, were vulgar and sordid, and ready to climb ladders, to walk the plank, to handle materials and look wise about them, to ask questions in fine and challenging explanations, and really go into figures. It amused, it verily quite charmed him, and by the same stroke it amused and even more Alice Stavern, though perhaps charming her perceptibly less. She weren't, however, going to be better off for it, as he were, and so astonishingly much. Nothing were now likely, he knew, ever to make her better off than she found herself in the afternoon of life, as the delicately frugal possessor and tenant of the small house in Irving's Place, to which she had subtly managed to cling through her almost unbroken New York career. If he knew the way to it now better than to any other address among the dreadful multiplied numberings, which seemed to him to reduce the old place to some vast ledger page, overgrown fantastic, of ruled and criss-crossed lines and figures, if he had formed, for his consolation, that habit, it would really not a little because of the charm of his having encountered and recognised, in the vast wilderness of the wholesale, breaking through the mere gross generalisation of wealth and force and success, a small still scene where items and shades, all delicate things, kept the sharpness of the notes of an R voice perfectly trained, and where economy hung about like the scent of a garden. His old friend lived with one maid and herself, dusted her relics and trimmed her lamps, and polished her silver. She stood off, in the awful modern crush, when she could, but she sallied forth and did battle when the challenge was really the spirit she after all confessed to, proudly and a little shyly, as that of the better time, that of their common, their quite far away and antediluvian social period and order. She made use of the streetcars when need be, the terrible things that people scramble for as the panic-stricken at sea scramble for the boats. She affronted inscrutably, under stress, all the public concussions and ordeals. And yet, with that slim, mystifying grace of her appearance, which defied you to say if she were a fair young woman who looked older through trouble, or a fine, smooth older one who looked young through successful indifference, with her precious reference, above all, the memories and histories, into which she could enter. She were as exquisite for him as some pale pressed flower, a rarity to begin with, and failing other sweetnesses, she was sufficient reward for his efforts. Their communities of knowledge, their knowledge, discriminating possessive, were always on her lips, of presences of the other age, presences all overlaid, in his case, by the experience of a man and the freedom of a wanderer, overlaid by pleasure, by infidelity, by passages of life that were strange and dim to her, just by Europe, in short, but still unobscured, still exposed and cherished under that pious visitation and the spirit from which she had never been diverted. She had come with him one day to see how his apartment house were rising. He had helped her over gaps and explained her plans, and while they were there, had happened to have before her a brief but lively discussion with the man in charge, a representative of the building firm that had undertaken his work. He found himself quite standing up with this personage over a failure on the latter's part to observe some detail of one of their noted conditions, and had so lucidly argued his case that, beside ever so prettily flushing at the time for sympathy in his triumph, she had afterwards said to him, though to a slightly greater effect of irony, that he had clearly for too many years neglected a real gift. If he had but stayed at home, he would have anticipated the inventor of the skyscraper. If he had but stayed at home, he would have discovered his genius in time really to start some new variety of awful architectural air and run it till it burrowed in a gold mine. You will remember these words, while the weeks elapsed, with a small silver ring they had sounded over the queerest and deepest of his own lately most disguised and most muffled vibrations. It had begun to be present to him after the first fortnight. It had broken out with the oddest abruptness, this particular wanton wonderment. It met him there, and this was the image under which he himself judged the matter, or at least not a little, thrilled and flushed with it, very much as he might have been met by some strange figure, some unexpected occupant, at a turn in one of the dim passages of an empty house. The quaint analogy quite hauntingly remained with him, and he didn't indeed rather improve it by a still intenser form, that of his opening a door beyond which he would have made sure of finding nothing, a door into a room shuttered and void, and yet so coming, with a great suppressed start, on some quiet, erect, confronting presence, something planted in the middle of the place and facing him through the dusk. After that visit to the house and construction, he walked with his companion to see the other, and always so much the better one, which in the eastward direction formed one of the corners, the jolly one precisely, of the street now so generally dishonoured and disfigured in its westward reaches, and of the comparatively conservative avenue. The avenue still had pretensions, as Miss Staverton said, to decency. The old people had mostly gone, the old names was unknown, and here and there an old association seemed to stray, all vaguely, like some very aged person out too late, whom you might meet and feel the impulse to watch or follow in kindness for safe restoration and shelter. They went in together, our friends, he admitted himself, with his key, as he kept no one there, he explained, preferring, for his reasons, to leave the place empty, under a simpler arrangement with a good woman living in the neighbourhood, who would come for a daily hour to open windows and dust and sweep. Spencer Bryden had his reasons, and he was growing aware of them. They seemed to him better each time he were there, though he didn't name them all to his companion, any more than he told her as yet how often, how quite absurdly often, he himself came. He only let her see for the present, while they walked through the great blank rooms, that absolute vacancy reigned, and that, from top to bottom, there were nothing but Mrs. Muldoon's broomstick in a corner to tempt the burglar. Mrs. Muldoon were then on the premises, and she loquaciously attended the visitors, preceding them from room to room, and pushing back shutters and throwing up sashes, all to show them, as she remarked, how little there were to see. There were little indeed to see in the great gaunt show, where the main dispositions and general apportionment of space, the style of an age of ampler allowances, and nevertheless, for its master, their honest pleading message, affecting him as some good old servant, some lifelong retainer's appeal for a character, or even for a retiring pension. It was also a remark of Miss Muldoon's that, glad as she were to oblige him by a noonday round, there were requests she greatly hoped he would never make of her. If he should wish her, for any reason, to come in after dark, she would just tell him, if he pleased, that he must ask it of somebody else. The fact that there were nothing to see didn't matter, also it didn't militate for the worthy woman against what one might see, and she put it frankly to Miss Staverton that no lady could be expected to like, could she, craping up to them top stories in the evil hours. The gas and the electric lights were off at the house, and she fairly evoked a gruesome vision of her march through the great grey rooms, so many of them as there were too, with their glimmering taper. Miss Staverton met her honest glare with a smile and the profession that she herself certainly would recoil from such an adventure. Spencer Bryden, meanwhile, held his peace. For the moment, the question of the evil hours in the old home had already become too grave for him. He had begun some time since to crepe, and he knew just why a packet of candles addressed to that pursuit had been stowed by his own hand 3 weeks before at the back of a drawer in the fine old sideboard that occupied, as a fixture, a deep recess in the dining room. Just now he laughed at his companion, quickly over changing the subject, the reason that, in the first place, his laugh struck him even as that moment as starting the odd echo, a conscious human resonance, he scarce knew how to qualify it, a sound made while he were there, alone sent back to his ear or his fancy, and that in the second, he imagined Alice Staverton for the instant on the point of asking him, with a divination, if he ever so proud. There were divinations he were unprepared for, and he had at all events averted inquiry by the time Mrs. Muldoon had left them, passing on to other parts. There was happily enough to say, on so consecrated a spot, that could be said freely and fairly, so that an old train of declarations were precipitated by his friends having themselves broken out, after a yearning look around. But I hope you don't mean they want you to pull this to pieces? His answer come promptly, with his reawakened wrath. It were of course exactly what they wanted, and what they were at him for, daily, with the iteration of people who couldn't for their life understand a man's liability to decent feelings. He had found the place, just as it stood, and beyond what he could express, an interest and a joy. There was values other than the beastly rent values, and in short, but it was us Miss Staverton took him up. In short, you're to make so good a thing of your skyscraper that, living in luxury on those ill-gotten gains, you can afford for a while to be sentimental here. Her smile had for him, with the words, the particular mild irony with which he found half our talk suffused, an irony without bitterness, that come exactly from her having so much imagination, not like the cheap sarcasm with which one may heard most people about the word of society, bid for the reputation of cleverness, from nobody's really having any. It were agreeable to him at this very moment to be sure that when he had answered, after a brief demur, "Why, yes, sir, precisely, you may put it," her imagination would still do him justice. He explained that even if never a dollar would have come to him from the other house, he would nevertheless cherish this one, and he dwelt further, while they lingered and wondered, on the fact that the stupefaction he were already exciting, the possessive mystification he felt himself create. He spoke of the value of all he had read into it, into the mere sight of the walls, the mere shape of the rooms, mere sound of the floors, mere feel in his hand of the old silver-plated knobs of the several mahogany doors, which suggested the pressure of the palms of the dead, the 70 years of the past, and fine that these things represented. The annals of nearly 3 generations, countless grandfathers, the one that had ended there, and the impalpable ashes of his long-extinct youth, afloat in the very air like microscopic motes. She listened to everything. She was a woman who answered intimately, but who utterly didn't chatter. She scattered abroad, therefore, no cloud of words. She could assent, she could agree, above all she could encourage, without doing that. Only at last she went a little further than he had done himself. "And then how do you know? You may still, after all, want to live here." It rather indeed pulled him up, for it wasn't what he had been thinking, at least in her sense of the word. "You mean I may decide to stay here on for the sake of it?" "Well, with such a home." But quite beautifully, she had too much tact that dot so monstrous an art, and it was precisely an illustration of the way she didn't rattle. How could anyone, of any wit, insist on anyone else wanting to live in New York? "Oh," he said, "I might have lived here, since I had my opportunity early in life. I might have put in here all these years. Then everything would have been different enough. And I dare say, funny enough. That's another matter. And the beauty of it, I mean of my perversity and my refusal to agree as to a deal, is just the total absence of a reason. Don't you see that if I had a reason about the matter at all, it would have to be the other way, and would then be inevitably a reason of dollars? There are no reasons here but of dollars. Let us therefore have none whatever, not the ghost of one." It was back in the hall for departure, but from where they stood the vista was large enough for an open door into the great square main saloon, with its almost antique feeling or felicity of brave spaces between windows. Her eyes come back from that reach and met his own a moment. Are you very sure the ghosts of one doesn't much rather serve? He had a positive sense of turning pale, but it were as near as they were to then to come. For he made answer, he believed, between a glare and a grin. Ah, ghosts. Of course this place must swarm with them. I should be ashamed of it if it didn't. Poor Mrs. Muldoon's right, and that's why I haven't asked her to do more than look in. Miss Staverton's gaze again lost itself. The things she didn't utter, that were clear, come and went round her mind. She might even, for the minute, off there in the fine room, have imagined some element dimly gathering, simplified like the death mask of an handsome face. It perhaps produced for her just then an effect akin to the stir of an expression in the set commemorative plaster. Yet wherever her impression may have been, she produced instead a vague platitude. Well, if it were only furnished and lived in. She appeared to imply that in the case of its being still furnished, he might have been a little less opposed to the idea of a return. But she passed straight into the vestibule, as if to leave her words behind her, and the next moment he had opened the ice door and was standing with her on the steps. He closed the door while he pocketed his key. Looking up and down, they took in the comparatively arse actuality of the avenue, which reminded him of the assault of the outer light of the desert and the traveller emerging from an Egyptian tomb. But he risked before they stepped into the street his gathered answer to her speech. For me it is lived in. For me it is furnished. At which it were easy for her to say, ah yes, all vaguely and discreetly, since his parents and his favourite sister. Hey Plague, congratulations on the 5-stream streak. Thank you for stopping by. Just to catch up to where we are, we're about 10 pages into the Jolly Corner. Man who has been away from New York for 33 years of his life, he's in his 50s now, has come back. He owns 2 properties there, one of which he's redoing into a set of apartments, the other of which he's keeping, which was his childhood home, I should say, he's keeping as it is, despite having received offers from people to do it up for money. And they've just had a tour of the old house, him and his lady friend, Miss Staverton, who he seemed like he has some sort of affection for, but their relationship isn't too detailed. And there's several hints that the house is haunted, it being old-fashioned and quite large for a New York residence, and no one being willing to go there at night, other than himself, who does apparently creep around there at night, but we don't know why. That's where we're at. Yeah, thank you for stopping by, I do appreciate it. For me it is lived in. For me it is furnished. At which it were easy for her to sigh, ah yes, all vaguely and discreetly. It's his parents. Love you too. And his favourite sister, to say nothing of other kin, in numbers, had run their course and met their end there. That represented, within the walls, ineffaceable laugh. But a few days after that, during an hour passed with her again, he had expressed his impatience for too flattering curiosity among the people he met, about his appreciation of New York. He after arrived at none at all that were socially producible, and as for that matter of his thinking the better or worse of anything there, he were only taken up with one subject of thought. It were mere vain egoism, and it were moreover, if she liked, a morbid obsession. He found all things come back to the question of what he personally might have been, how he might have lived or might have led his life, and turned out, if he had not so, at the outset, given it up. And confessing for the first time the intensity within him of this absurd speculation, which but proved also, no doubt, the habit too selfishly of thinking, he affirmed the impotence there of any other source of interest, any other native appeal. What would it have made of me? What would it have made of me? I keep forever wondering, all idiotically, as if I could possibly know. I see what it has made of dozens of others, those I meet, and it positively aches within me, to the point of exasperation, that it would have made of something to me as well. Only I can't make out what, and the worry of it, the small rage of curiosity now to be satisfied, brings back what I remember to have felt, once or twice, after judging best for reason, to burn some important letter unopened. I've been sorry, I've hated it. I've never known what were in the letter. You may of course say it's a trifle. I don't say it's a trifle, Miss Staverton gravely interrupted. She was seated by her fire, and before her, on his feet and restless, he turned to and fro between this intensity of his idea and a fitful and unseeing inspection through his single eyeglass of the dear little old objects in her chimney piece. Her interruption made him, for an instant, look at her harder. I shouldn't care if you did, he laughed, however, and it's only a figure at any rate, for the way I now feel. Not to have followed my perverse young course, and almost in the teeth of my father's curse, as I may say. Not to have kept it up so over there from that day to this, without a doubt or pang. Not, above all, to have liked it, to have loved it, so much loved it, no doubt, with such an abysmal conceit of my own preference. Some variation from that. I say I must have produced some different effect for my life, and for my form. I should have stuck here, if it had been possible, and I were too young at 23 to judge, au dessus, whether it were possible. If I had waited, I might have seen it were. And then I might have been, by staying here, something nearer to one of these types, what have been camoured so hard and made so keen by their conditions. In that I admire them so much, the question of any charm in them, or of any charm beyond that, of the rank money passion exerted by their condition for them, has nothing to do with the matter. It's only a question of what fantastic yet perfectly possible development of my own nature I mayn't have missed. It comes over me that I had then a strange alter ego deep down somewhere within me, as the full-blown flower is in the small ripe bud, and that I just took the course, I just transferred into the climate that blighted him for once and forever. And you wonder about the flower, Miss Staverton said. So do I, if you want to know, and so I've been wondering these several weeks. I believe in the flower, she continued. I feel it would have been quite splendid, quite huge and monstrous. Monstrous above all, her visitor echoed, and I imagine by the same stroke quite hideous and offensive. You don't believe that, she returned. If you did, you wouldn't wonder. You'd know, and that would be enough for you. What you feel, and what I feel for you, is that you'd have had power. You'd have liked me that way, he asked. She barely hung fire. How should I not have liked you? I see. You'd have liked me, have preferred me a billionaire. How should I not have liked you? She simply again asked. He stood before her still. Her question kept him motionless. He took it in, so much as there was of it, and indeed, his not otherwise meeting it testified to that. I know, at least, what I am, he simply went on. The other side of the medal's clear enough. I've not been edifying. I believe I'm thought in 100 quarters to have been barely decent. I've followed strange paths and worshipped strange gods. Must have come to you again and again. In fact, you've admitted to me as much. That I were leading at any time these 30 years a selfish, frivolous, scandalous life. And you see what he has made of me. She just waited, smiling at him. You see what he has made of me. Oh, that's true. You see what it has made of me. Ah, you're just a person who nothing can have altered. You was born to be what you are, anywhere, anyway. You the perfection, nothing else could have blighted. And don't you see how, without my exile, I should have been wilted till now? But he pulled up for the strange pan. The great thing to see, she presently said, seems to me to be that it has spoiled nothing. It hasn't spoiled your being here at last. It hasn't spoiled this. It hasn't spoiled your speaking. She also, however, faltered. He wondered everything her controlled emotions might mean. Do you believe, then, too dreadfully, that I am as good as I might ever have been? Oh no, far from it. With which she got up from the chair and went nearer to him. But I don't care. She smiled. You mean I'm good enough? She considered a little. Will you believe it if I say so? I mean, will you let that settle your question for you? And then, as if making out in his face that he drew back from this, he had some idea which, however absurd, he couldn't yet bargain away. Oh, you don't care either. But very differently. You don't care for anything but yourself. Spencer Bryden recognised it. In fact, in fact what he had absolutely professed. Yet he importantly qualified, he isn't myself. He's the just so totally other person. But I do want to see him, he added, and I can, and I shall. Their eyes met for a minute, while he guessed for something in hers that she divined his strange sense. But neither of them otherwise expressed it, and her apparent understanding, with no protesting shock, no easy derision, touched him more deeply than anything yet, constituting for his startled perversity, on the spot, an element that will like breathable air. What she said, however, were unexpected. Well, I have seen him. You? I've seen him in a dream. Oh, a dream. It let him down. But twice over, she continued. I saw him as I see you now. You've dreamed the same dream? Twice over, she repeated. The very same. This did, somehow, a little speak to him, as it also gratified him. You dream about me at that rate? Ah, about him, she smiled. His eyes again sounded her. And you know all about him. And as she said nothing more, what's the wretch like? She hesitated, and it were as if he were pressing her so hard that, resisting for reasons of her own, she had to turn away. I'll tell you some other time. That's the end of the first part. I'll pause it over a little swallow. Water. Oh, fair play, yeah. I'm hunched over a little bit. Oh. Straighten us up then. Well, I shall deliver this little accounting of my thoughts on this chapter while standing and facing directly forward as if I were a professional newscaster. I don't think they let that rats be on the news, but we'll do it anyway. So, this just in. It's an interesting little story so far. Like, unlike with Owen Wingrave, I sort of see where this is immediately coming in from the sort of ghost angle. It deals a lot more with the past, and obviously you've got the big old house, which is classic, and the hints at things or something being going on in there. But also you have this idea of memory, of past, and other options taken. Your man, what was he called again? Spencer, was it? He's a man who is very clearly haunted, in more than one sense. Haunted by the spectre of who he might have been, haunted by the choices he's made. Haunted by a past that he cannot quite re-find. He strikes me as being an exceptional person to be haunted by some sort of literal ghost on top of it, so we'll see how that goes. Yeah. Other than that, I think that the figure who's with him is also interesting. She strikes me as perceptive, and obviously he's very fond of her, but I don't know. There's something about her, a sort of quiet, understated way in which she carries herself. Hints at deep waters. I suppose we shall find out. There's only really one way to do that, so we shall press on. Two. It were after this, there were most of a virtue for him, most of a cultivated charm, most of a preposterous secret thrill, in the particular form of surrender that was obsession, and of address to what he more and more believed to be his privilege. It were what, in these weeks, he were living for, since he really felt life to begin, but after Miss Muldoon had retired from the scene and, visiting the ample house from attic to cellar, making sure he were alone, he knew himself in safe possession and, as he tacitly expressed it, let himself go. He sometimes come twice in the 24 hours. The moments he liked best were those at gathering dusk, the short autumn twilight. This was the time on which, again and again, he found himself open most. Then he could, it seemed to him, most intimately wander. Okay. Well, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, Ward, and thank you again for stopping by. Then he could, it seemed to him, most intimately wander and wait, linger and listen, feel his fine attention, never in his life before so fine, on the pulse of the great vague place. He preferred the lampless hour, and only wished he might have prolonged each day a deep crepuscular spell. Later, rarely much before midnight, but then for a considerable vigil, he watched with his glimmering light, moving slowly, holding it hard, playing it far, rejoicing above all, as much as he might, in open vistas, reaches of communication between rooms and by passages, the long straight chance or show, as he would have called it, of the revelation he pretended to invite. It were a practice he found he could perfectly work without enticing remark. No one were in the least the wiser for it. Even Alice Staverton, who were moreover a well of discretion, didn't quite fully imagine. He let himself in, and let himself out with the assurance of calm proprietorship. An accident so far favoured him that, if a Fat Avenue officer had happened on occasion to see him entering at 11:30, he had never yet, to the best of his belief, been noticed as emerging at 2. He walked there on the crisp November nights, arrived regularly at the evening's end. It were as easy to do this after dining out as to take his way to a club or his hotel. When he left his club, if he hadn't been dining out, it were ostensibly to go to his hotel. And when he left his hotel, if he had spent a part of the evening there, it were ostensibly to go to his club. Everything were easy and fun. Everything conspired and promoted. There were truly, even in the strain of his experience, something that glossed over, something that salved and simplified all the rest of consciousness. He circulated, talked, renewed, loosely and pleasantly, old relations, met indeed, so far as he could, new expectations, and seemed to make out on the old that in spite of the career, such different contacts, which he had spoken of to Miss Staverton, as ministering so little, for those who might have watched it, to edification, who were positively rather liked than not. He were a dim, secondary social success, and all were people who had truly not an idea of him. It were all mere surface sound, this murmur of their welcome, this popping of their corks, just as his gestures and responses were the extravagant shadows, emphatic in proportion as they meant little, for some game of ombre chinoise. He projected himself all day, in thought, straight over the bristling line of hard, unconscious heads, and into the other, the real, the waiting life, the life that, as soon as he had heard behind the click of his great house door, begun for him on the jolly corner, as beguilingly as the slow opening bars of some rich music follows the tap of the conductor's wand. He always caught the first effect of the steel point of his stick on the old marble of the old pavement, large black and white squares that he remembered as the admonition of his childhood, and that had then made him, as he now saw, for the growth of an early conception of style. This effect with a dim reverberating tinkle, as of some far-off bell, hung who should say where, in the depths of the house, of the past, of that mystical other world that might have flourished for him, had he not, for weal or woe, abandoned it. On this impression, he did ever the same thing. He put his stick noiselessly away in a corner, feeling the place once more in the likeness of some great glass bowl, all precious concave crystal, set delicately humming by the play of a moist finger round its edge. A concave crystal held, as it were, this mystical other world, and the indescribably fine murmur of its rim with a sigh there, the scarce audible pathetic wail to a strained ear, of all the old baffled forsworn possibilities. What he did, therefore, by this appeal of hushed presences, was to wake them in such measure of ghostly life as they might still enjoy. They were shy, all but unappeasably shy, but they wasn't really sinister, as they weren't as he had hitherto felt them. Before they had taken form, he so yearned to make them take the form that he at moments saw himself in the light of fairly on the tiptoe, the point of his evening shoes from room to room and from story to story. This was the essence of his vision, which were all rank folly, if one would, while he were out the house and otherwise occupied, which took on the last verisimilitude as soon as he were placed and posted. He knew what he meant and what he wanted. It was clear as the figure on a cheque presented in demand for cash. His alter ego walked. That was the note of his image of him, while his image of his motive, for his own odd pastime, was a desire to waylay him and meet him. He roamed, slowly, warily, but all restlessly himself did. Mrs. Muldoon had been right, absolutely, with her figure there, graping, and the presence he watched for would roam restlessly too. But it would be as cautious and as shifty. The conviction of its probable, in fact its already quite sensible, quite audible invasion of pursuit grew for him from night to night to night, laying on him finally a rigour which nothing in his life had been comparable. It had been the theory of many superficially judging persons, he knew, that he were wasting his life in surrender to sensation. But he had tasted of no pleasure so far as his actual tension, had been introduced to no sport that demanded at once the patience and the nerve of this stalking of a creature more subtle, yet at bay, perhaps more formidable, than any beast of the forest. The terms, the comparisons, the very practices of the chase positively come again into play. There was even moments when passages of his occasional experience as a sportsman stirred memories from his younger time of moor and mountain and desert, revived for him, and to the increase of his keenness, by the tremendous force of analogy. He found himself at moments, once he had placed his single light on some mantel shelf, or in some recess, stepping back into shelter or shade, effacing himself behind a door, or in an embrasure, as he had sought of old the vantage of rock and tree. He found himself holding his breath, and living in the joy of the instants, the supreme suspense created by big game alone. He weren't afraid of putting himself to question, as he believed gentlemen on Bengal tiger shoots were in close quarters with the great bear of the Rockies had been known to confess to having put it. And this indeed, since here at least he might be frank, because of the impression, so intimate and so strange, that he himself produced, as yet a dread, produced certainly a strain, beyond the liveliness we're likely to feel. They fell for him in their categories. They fairly become familiar. Hey Nazca, thank you for stopping by. Catch you up. We're about halfway through now, I think, the Jolly Corner. Man who has lived most of his life out of America and Europe, in a life of leisure, has come back to the city of New York to look into some properties he owns, one of which is converted into flats, the other of which he keeps a big old style house, which is empty despite having lucrative offers for it. And he's talked to a woman of his acquaintance about the person he might have been had he stayed in New York and fought rather than living as he sees a life of easy leisure. And now stepping into the second chapter, we see that he has made a habit now that he apparently lives for of coming to this house, the big one that he likes, after dark, and just creeping around it in this sort of strange reverse search for himself in some manner. And he's describing it currently in terms of a big game hunt as he searches for this person who he might have been had he never left New York. And that's where we're at. Yeah, thank you for stopping by. They fell for him in the categories. They fairly become familiar. The signs, for his own perception, of the alarm his presence and his vigilance created, though leaving him always to remark, portentously, on his probably having formed a relation, his probably enjoying a conscientiousness unique in the experience of man. People enough, first and last, have been in terror of apparitions, but who had ever before so turned the tables and become himself, in the apparitional world, an incalculable terror. Okay, Plague, well, I do appreciate you being here, even if you are just lurking. I will very much attempt to have a good one. He might have found this sublime, but he quite dared to think of it. But he didn't too much insist, truly, on that side of his privilege. With habit and repetition he gained, to an extraordinary degree, the power to penetrate the dusk of distance and the darkness of corners, to resolve back into their innocence the treacheries of uncertain light, the evil-looking forms taken in the gloom by mere shadows, by accidents of the air, by shifting effects of perspective. Putting down his dim luminary, he could still wander on without it, pass into other rooms and, only knowing it were there beyond him in case of need, see his way about, visually project for his purpose in comparative clearness. It made him feel. Congratulations on the 7 Stream Street, Master. I do appreciate it. It's always nice to know that people like to stick by me. Makes me feel special, fuzzy and warm. It made him feel, this acquired faculty, like some monstrous stealthy cat. He wondered if he would have glared at these moments with large shining yellow eyes, and what it might verily be, the poor hard-pressed alter ego, to be confronted with such a type. He liked, however, the open shutters. He opened everywhere those Miss Muldoon had closed, closing them as carefully afterwards, so that she shouldn't notice it. He liked, oh this he did like, and above all in the upper rooms, the sense of the hard silver of the autumn stars through the window panes, and scarcely less the flares of the street lamps below, the white electric lustre which it would have taken curtains to keep out. This were human, actual social. This were the world he had lived in, and he was more at his ease, certainly, for the countenance, coldly general and impersonal, all the while, and in spite of the detachment it seemed to give him. He had support, of course, mostly in the rooms, at the wide front and the prolonged side. It failed him considerably in the central shades, and the parts at the back. But if he sometimes, on his rounds, were glad of his optical reach, so none the less often the rear of the house affected him as the very jungle of his prey. The place was there more subdivided, a large extension in particular, where small rooms for servants had been multiplied, abounded in nooks and corners, in closets and passages, and the ramifications especially of an ample back staircase, over which he leaned many a time to look far down. Not deterred from his gravity, even well aware that he might, for a spectator, have figured some solemn simpleton playing at hide and seek. Outside, in fact, he might himself make the ironic rapprochement, but within the walls, and in spite of the clear windows, his consistency were proof against the cynical light of New York. And we're just about to have ad, so I'll pause there for a moment. Catch you on the other side. Now I have a quick swallow of water. And having had that drink, let's chat a little about the breakdown that's happened here, shall we? So first things first, what is interesting to me is that the way he's describing hunting himself through the shadows here really sort of, I don't know, it strikes me weirdly in a way as remarkably familiar, which I think it isn't meant to be. I sort of get the sense that this is expected to be a very strange or absent thing, something that is meant to be like, you know, a very weird thing that he's doing, which of course, you know. But I don't know, I find it kind of hauntingly familiar in a sort of, I mean obviously I haven't had a big old house to stalk through looking for an altered version myself. But the idea of, I don't know, the idea of looking for yourself, of seeking some person whom you might have been, really does speak to me, because it's something that I found I've done myself at certain times. And even in the way he's sort of framing it, as this stalking of a self, of a prey that one is hunting, the feeling like some kind of predator stalking it, is familiar to me. I think perhaps it comes with the sort of unusual sense of self I have, of the acquired sense of who I am, on account of the strange goo that I ate that made me into a different sort of being. But the idea of the self that is and the idea of the self that might be, especially when that self goes through a great metamorphosis, or indeed is going through such a metamorphosis, I find it very relatable, the idea of seeking a person one might have been. Well, I must admit also, I think that there's something to be said for just having a place that you can scutter about and scurry around in. This big old house full of memories and shadows, you know, it's something to do. It is a sort of game to him, and obviously he's finding something psychologically fulfilling in it, so it plays multiple purposes in his mind. But I think just in general, people would be happier if they spent some time dedicating themselves to doing something a little weird like that. Running around a dark house, or, you know, engaging in some sort of absurd activity. There's this idea of play as being something that's for children, but play is a useful activity, not just in terms of, you know, video games and that, but in pretend, in imagination. There's all sorts of ideas in psychology about the advantages of play provides in simulating ideas and experiences. And I think you'll find in this catharsis as well, it is a very useful tool to engage with. Anyhow, I'll have another quick swallow of water, and then we'll get back into things, because the ad should have ended now. Rightio then. Now where was that place? There we are. It belonged to that idea of the exasperated consciousness of his victim becoming a real test for him, since he had quite to put it to himself from the first that, oh distinctly, he could cultivate his whole perception. He felt it as above all open to cultivation, which indeed were but another name for his manner of spending his time. We were bringing it on, bringing it to perfection by practice, in consequence of which it had grown so fine. We were now aware of impressions, attestations of his general postulate that couldn't have broken upon him at once. This was the case more specifically with a phenomenon at last quite frequent for him in the upper rooms. The recognition, absolutely unmistakable, and by a turn dating from a particular hour, his resumption of his campaign after a diplomatic drop, a calculated absence of 3 nights, of his being definitely followed, tracked at a distance carefully taken, and the express end that he should less confidently, less arrogantly appear to himself, merely the pursuit. It worried, it finally quite broke him up, for it proved of all the conceivable impressions the one least suited to his book. He were kept in sight while remaining himself, as regards the essence of his position, sightless, and his only recourse then were in abrupt turns, rapid recoveries of ground. He wheeled about, retracing his steps, as if he might so catch in his face at least the stirred air of some other quick revolution. It were indeed true that his fully dislocalised thought of these manoeuvres recalled to him Pantaloon at the Christmas farce, buffeted and tricked from behind by ubiquitous Harlequin, but left intact the influence of the conditions themselves each time he were re-exposed to them. So in fact this association, he had suffered it to become constant, would on certain side have but ministered to his intenser gravity. He had made, as I have said, to create on the premises the baseless sense of a reprieve, his 3 absences, and the result of the third would confirm the after effect of the second. On his return that night, the night succeeding his last intermission, he stood in the hall and looked up the staircase with a certainty more intimate than any he had yet known. He's there, at the top and waiting, not as in general falling back for disappearance. He's holding his ground, and it's the first time, which is a proof, isn't it, that something has happened for him. So Braden argued with his hand on the banister and his foot on the lower step, in which position he felt as never before the air chilled by his logic. He himself turned cold in it, for he seemed of a sudden to know what was now involved. Hard oppressed. Yes, he takes it in with us, making it clear to him that I've come, as they say, to stay. He finally doesn't like and can't bear it. In the same sense, I mean that his wrath, his menaced interest, now balances with his dread. I've hunted him till he has turned. That up there is what has happened. He's the fanged or the antlered animal brought at last to bay. They come to him, as I say, but determined by an influence beyond my notion, the acuteness of his certainty, under which, however, the next moment he had broken into a sweat. He would have little consented to attribute to fear, as he would have dared to immediately act upon it, for enterprise. It marked, none the less, a prodigious thrill, a thrill that represented sudden dismay, no doubt, but also represented, and with the self-same throb, the strangest, the most joyous, possibly the next minute, almost the proudest duplication of consciousness. He has been dodging, retreating, hiding, but now, worked up in anger, he'll fight. This intense impression made a single mouthful, as it were, of terror and applause. But what wondrous, without the applause, felt for that. But what was wondrous was that the applause, for the felt fact, was so eager, since if it were his other self he were running to earth, this ineffable identity with us in the last resort, not unworthy of him. It bristled there, somewhere near at hand, however unseen still, as the hunted thing, even as the trodden worm of the adage, must at last bristle. And Bryden, at this instant, tasted probability of a sensation more complex than he had ever before found it itself tasted probably of a sensation more complex than had ever before found itself consistent with sanity. It was as if it would have shamed him that a character so associated with his own should triumphantly succeed in just skulking off, should to the end not risk the open, so that the drop of this danger were, on the spot, a great lift to the old situation. Yet with another rare shift of the same subtlety, he were already trying to measure by how much more he himself might now be in peril of fear, so rejoicing that he could, in another form, actively inspire that fear, and simultaneously quaking for the form in which he might passively know it. The apprehension of knowing it must after a little have grown in him, and the strangest moment of his adventure, perhaps, the most memorable, or really most interesting afterwards, of his crises, were the lapse of certain instants of concentrated conscious combat, a sense of a need to hold on to something, even after the manner of a man slipping on some awful incline. The vivid old impulse, above all, to move, to act, to charge somehow upon something, to show himself, in a word, that he weren't afraid. The state of holding on was thus the state to which he was momentarily reduced. If there had been anything in the great vacancy, to seize, he would presently have been aware of having it clutched, as he might, under a shock at home, have clutched the nearest chair back. He had been surprised, at any rate. Of this he were aware, into something unprecedented since his original appropriation of the place. He closed his eyes, held them tight for a long minute, as with the instinct of dismay and the terror of vision. When he opened them, the room, the other contagious rooms extraordinarily, seemed lighter, so light almost, that at first he took the change for day. He stood firm, however, it might be, just where he had paused. His resistance had helped him. It was as if there was something he had tided over. He knew after a little where it were. It had been in the imminent danger of flight. He had stiffened his will against going. Without this he would have made for the stairs, and it seemed to him that, still with his eyes closed, he would have descended them, would have known how, straight and swiftly, to the bottom. Well, as he had held out, here he were, still at the top, among the more intricate upper rooms, and with the gauntlet of the others, of all the rest of the house still to run when it should be his time to go. He would go at his time, only at his time. Didn't he go every night very much at the same hour? He took out his watch. There were light for that. It was scarcely 1:15. He had never withdrawn so soon. He reached his lodgings for the most part at 2, with his walk of a quarter of an hour. He would wait for the last quarter. He wouldn't stir till then, and he kept his watch there with his eyes upon it, reflecting while he held it. This deliberate wait, a wait with an effort which he recognised, would serve perfectly for the attestation he desired to make. It would prove his courage, unless indeed the latter might most be proved by his budging at last from his place. What he mainly felt now was that, since he hadn't originally scuttled, he had his dignities, which had never in his life seemed so many, all to preserve and to carry aloft. This was before him in truth, as physical image, an image almost worthy of an age of greater romance. That remark indeed glimmered for him, only to glow the next instant with a finer light, since what age of romance, after all, could have matched either the state of his mind or, objectively, as they said, the wonder of his situation? The only difference would have been that, brandishing his dignities over his head, as in a parchment scroll, he might then, that is in the heroic times, have proceeded downstairs with a drawn sword in his upper grasp. At present, really, the light had to be set down on the mantel of the next room, would have to figure his sword, which utensil, in the course of a minute, he had taken the requisite number of steps to possess himself of. The door between the rooms were open, and from the second another door opened to a third. These rooms, as he remembered, gave all three upon a common corridor as well, but there were a fourth beyond them, without issue, save through the preceding. To have moved, to have heard his step again, were appreciably an help, though even in recognising this he lingered once more, a little, by the chimney-piece, on which his light had rested. When he next moved, just hesitating where to turn, he found himself considering a circumstance that, after his first and comparatively vague apprehensions of it, produced in him the start that often attends some pang of recollection, the violent shock of having ceased happily to forget. He had come in at sight of the door in which the brief chain of communication ended, and which he now surveyed from the nearer threshold, the one not directly facing it. Placed at some distance to the left at that point, it would have admitted him the last room of the four, the room without the other approaches or egress, had it not, to his intimate conviction, been closed since his former visitation, the map probably over a quarter of an hour before. He stared with all his eyes at the wonder of the fact, arrested again where he stood and again holding his breath, while he sounded its sense. Surely it had been subsequently closed, as it had been on this previous passage indubitably open. He took it full in the face that something had happened between. He couldn't not have noticed before, by which he meant on his original tour of all the rooms that evening, that such a barrier had exceptionally presented itself. He had indeed, since that moment, undergone an agitation so extraordinary that it might have muddled for him any earlier view. He tried to convince himself that he might perhaps then have gone into the room and, inadvertently, automatically on coming out, have drawn the door after him. The difficulty was that this exactly was what he had never did. It were against his old policy, he might have said, the essence of which were to keep vistas clear. He had them from the first, as he were well aware, quite on the brain. The strange apparition at the far end of one of them, of his baffled prey, which had become by so sharp an irony, so little the term now to apply. With the former success, his imagination had most cherished, projecting it into it always a refinement of beauty. He had known 50 times the start of perception, had afterwards dropped, and 50 times gasped to himself, there, under some fond brief hallucination. The house, as the case stood, admirably lent itself, he might wonder at the taste, the native architecture of the particular time, which could rejoice so in the multiplication of doors, the opposite extreme of the modern, the actual almost complete prescription of them, that had fairly contributed to provoke this obsession of the presence, encountered telescopically, as he might say, focused and studied in diminishing perspective, and, as by a rest for the elbow. It were with these considerations that his present attention were charged. They perfectly availed to make what he saw portentous. He couldn't, by any lapse, have blocked the aperture, and if he hadn't, if it were unthinkable, why what else were clear but that there had been another agent. Another agent. He had been catching, as he felt, a moment back, the very breath of him. But when had he been so close as in this simple, this logical, this completely personal act? It was so logical that one might have taken it for personal. Yet for what did Barden take it, he asked himself, while, softly panting, he felt his eyes almost leave their sockets. This time at last, they were, the two, opposed projections of him in presence, and this time, much as one would, the question of danger loomed. With it rose, as not before, the question of courage. For when he knew the blank face of the door to say to him were, "Show us how much you have." Instead, it glared back at him with that challenge. It put to him the two alternatives. Should he just push it open or not? To have this consciousness would a think, and a think, Braden knew, as he stood there, was, with lapse of moments, not to have acted. Not to have acted, that were the misery and the pang. Or even still not to act, or in fact all to feel the thing in another, in a new and terrible way. How long did he pause, and how long did he debate? There were presently nothing to measure it, for his vibration had already changed, as just by the effect of intensity. Shut up there at bay, defiant, without the prodigy of the thing palpably, provably done, as given notice like some stark signboard. Under that accession of accent, the situation itself had turned, and Bryden at last remarkably made up his mind on what he had turned to. It had turned altogether with different admonition to a supreme imp for him of the value of discretion. This slowly dawned, no doubt, for it could take its time so perfectly on this threshold, had even stayed, so little as yet had he either advanced or retreated. It were the strangest of all things that now, when, by his taking 10 steps and applying his hand to a latch, or even his shoulder and his knee, if necessary, to panel all the hunger of his prime need might have been met, his high curiosity crowned, his unrest assuaged. It were amazing, but it were also exquisite and rare, that instance. That instant should have, at a touch, quite dropped from him. Discretion, He jumped at that, and yet not, verily, at such a pitch, because it saved his nerves or his skin, because much more valuably, it saved the situation. When I say he jumped at it, I feel the connaissance of this term with the fact that, at the end indeed, of I know not how long, he did move again. He crossed straight to the door. He wouldn't touch it. It seemed now that he might, if he would. He would only just wait there a little, to show, to prove that he wouldn't. He had thus another station, close to his thin partition, by which revelation were denied him, but with his eyes bent and his hands held off in a mere intensity of stillness. He listened as if there had been something to hear. This attitude, while it lasted, was his own communication. If you won't, then good, I spare you and I give up. You affect me as by the appeal positively for pity. You convince me that for reasons rigid and sublime, what do I know? We both of us should have suffered. I respect them, then, and though moved in privileges, I believe, it has never been me to a man. I retire, I renounce, ne'er in my honour to try again. So rest forever, and let me. That for Bryden with a deep sense of this last demonstration, solemn, measured, directed as he felt it to be. He brought it to a close. He turned away, and now verily he knew how deeply it had been stirred. He retraced his steps, taken up his candle, burnt, he observed, well nigh in the socket, and marking again, lighting it as he would, the distinctiveness of his footfalls, after which in a moment he knew himself at the other side of the house. He did hear what he had not yet done these hours. He opened half the casement, one of those in the front, and let in the air of the night, a thing he would have taken any time previously for a sharp rupture of his spell. His spell was broken now, it didn't matter, broken by his concession and his surrender, which made it idle henceforth that he should ever come back. The empty street, its other life so marked even by the great lamplit vacancy, were within call, within touch. He stayed there as to be in it again, high above it though he was still perched, and watched as for some comforting common fact, some vulgar human though, the passage of a scavenger or a thief, some night bird or other base. He would have blessed that sign of life. He would have welcomed positively the slow approach of his friend the policeman, whom he had hitherto only sought to avoid, and were not sure that the patrol had come into sight. He mightn't have felt the impulse to get into relation with it, to hail it on some pretext from his fourth floor. The pretext that wouldn't have been too silly or too compromising, the explanation that would have saved his dignity and kept his name, in such case, out of the papers, were not definite to him. He was so occupied with the thought of recording his discretion, as an effect of the vow he had just uttered to his intimate adversary, the importance of this loomed large, something had overtaken all, ironically, his sense of proportion. If there had been a ladder applied to the front of the house, even one of the vertiginous perpendiculars employed by painters and roofers, and sometimes left standing overnight, he would have managed somehow, astride of the window still, to compass by outstretched leg and arm that mode of descent. If there had been some such uncanny thing as he had found in his room, at hotels, a work-table fire escape in the form of a notched cable or a canvas chute, he would have availed himself of it as proof, well of his present delicacy. He nursed that sentiment, as the question stood, a little in vain, and even, at the end of he scarce knew once more how long, found it, as by the action on his mind, of the failure of response to the outer world, sinking back to vague anguish. It seemed to him he had waited an age for some stir of the great grim hush. The life of the town were itself under a spell, so unnaturally up and down the old prospect of known and rather ugly objects. The blankness and the silence lasted. Had they ever, he asked himself, the hard-faced houses which had begun to look livid in the dim dawn, had they ever spoken so little to any need of his spirit? Great bully voids, great crowded stillness put on often in the outer cities, the small hours, a sort of sinister mask, and it were of this large collective negation that Braden presently became conscious. All the more that the break of day were, almost incredibly, now at hand, proving to him what a night he had made of it. I'm going to pause here for a moment to have a quick swallow of water. Still seems a good time for that. He looked again at his watch, saw what had become of his time values. He had taken hours for minutes, not as in other tense situations, minutes for hours. And the strange air of the streets were but the weak, the sullen flush of a dawn, in which everything was still locked up. His choked appeal from his own open window had been the sole note of life, and he could but break off at last, as for a worse despair. Yet while so deeply demoralised, he were capable again of an impulse denoting, at least by his present measure, extraordinary resolution, of retracing steps to the spot where he had turned cold, the extinction of his last pulse of doubt as to there being in the place another presence than his own. This required an effort strong enough to sicken him, but he had his reasons, which overmastered for the moment everything else. There were the whole of the rest of the house to reverse, and how should he screw himself to that if the doors he had seen closed were at present open? He could hold the idea that closing had practically been for him an act of mercy, a chance offered him to descend, depart, and get off the ground, and there again profane it. This conception held together. It worked. But what it meant for him depended now clearly on the amount of forbearance his recent action, or rather his recent inaction, had engendered. The image of the presence, wherever it were, waiting there for him to go, this image had not yet been so concrete for his nerves as when he stopped short of the point at which certainly would have come to him. For with all his resolution, or more exactly with all his dread, he did stop short. He hung back from really seeing. The risk was too great, and his fear too definite. It took at this moment an awful specific form. He knew, yes, as he had never known anything, that should he see the door open, it would all too abjectly be the end of him. It would mean that the agent of his shame, for his shame with deep abjection, were once more at large and in general possession, and what glared at him thus in the face were the act that this would determine for him. It would send him straight about to the window he had left open, and, by that window, be a long ladder and dangling rope, as absent as they would, he saw himself so uncontrollably, insanely, fatally take his way into the street. The hideous chance of this he at least could avert. He could only avert it by recoiling in time from the assurance. He had the whole house to deal with, that fact was still there, and he now knew that the uncertainty alone could start him. He stole back from where he had checked himself, merely to do so was suddenly like safety, and making blindly for the great staircase, or the greater staircase, left gaping rooms and sounding passages beyond. Here were the top of the stairs, with a fine, large, dim descent, and 3 spacious landings to mark off. His instincts were all for mildness, but his feet was harsh on the floor, and strangely, when he had in a couple of minutes become aware of this, he had counted somehow for help. He couldn't have spoken, the tone of his voice would have scared him, and the common conceit or resource of whistling in the dark, whether literally or figuratively, had appeared basely vulgar. He liked none the less to hear himself go, and when he had reached his first landing, taking it all with no rush, quite steadily, and stages of success drew from him a gasp of relief. The house withal seemed immense, the scale of space again inordinate. The open rooms, to no one of which his eyes deflected, gloomed in their shuttered state, like the mouths of caverns. Only the arched skylights that formed the crown of the deep well created for him a medium in which he could advance, which suddenly might have been, for queerness of colour, some watery underworld. He tried to think of something noble, as that his property were really grand, a splendid possession, but this nobleness took the form of the clear delight with which he would finally to sacrifice it. They might come in now, the builders, the destroyers. They might come as soon as they would. At the end of 2 flights he had dropped to another zone. From the middle of the 3rd, with only 1 more left, he recognised the influence of the lower windows, the half-drawn blinds and the occasional gleam of street lamps, the glazed spaces of the vestibule. This was the bottom of the sea, and showed an illumination of its own, which he even saw paved, when at a given moment he drew up the sink, a long look over the banister, with the marble squares of his childhood. By that time, indubitably, he felt, as he might have said, in a commoner cause, better. It had allowed him to stop and draw breath, and the ease increased with the sight of the old black and white slabs. What he most felt was that now, surely, with the element of impunity pulling him as by hard, firm hands, the case was settled for what he might have seen above had he dared these last looks. The closed door, blessedly remote now, was still closed, and he had only in short to reach that of the house. He come down farther. He crossed the passages forming the access to the last flight, and if here again he stopped an instant, here almost for the sharpness of the thrill of assured escape. It made him shut his eyes, which opened again to the straight slope of the remainder of these stairs. Here were impunity still, but impunity almost excessive, inasmuch as the side light and the eye-fan tracery of the entrance were glimmering straight into the hall. An appearance produced, he the next instant saw, by the fact that the vestibule gaped wide. The hinged halves of the inner doors had been thrown far back. Out of that again, the question sprang at him, making his eyes, as he felt, half start from his head, as they had done at the top of the house before the sight of the other doors. If he had left that one open, hadn't he left this one closed? Wasn't he now in most immediate presence of some inconceivable occult activity? It was sharp, the question, as a knife in his side. The answer hung far still and seemed to lose itself in the vague darkness to which the thin admitted dawn glimmered and archwise over the owl outer door, made a semicircular margin, a cold silvery nimbus, that seemed to play a little as he looked, to shift, expand and contract. It was as if there had been something within it, protected by indistinctness, and corresponding in extent with the opaque surface. Behind the painted panels of the last barrier to his escape, which the key were in his pocket, the indistinctness mocked him, even while he stared, affected him as somehow shrouding, challenging certitude, so that after faltering an instant on his step, he let himself go with the sense that here were at last something to meet, to touch, to know, to take, something all unnatural and dreadful, but to advance upon which was a condition for him, either a liberation or a supreme defeat. The penumbras, deep and dark, were the virtual screen of a figure which stood in it as still as some image erect in a niche, or as some black vaseted sentinel guarding the treasure. Braden would know afterwards, would recall and make out, a particular thing he had believed during the rest of his descent. He saw, in its great grey glimmering margin, the central vagueness diminish, and he felt it to be taking the very form towards which, for so many days, the passion of his curiosity had yearned. It gloomed, it loomed, it was somebody, prodigy of a personal presence. Rigid and conscious, spectral yet human, a man of his own subsistence and stature waited there to measure himself with his power to dismay. This only could it be, this only till he recognised, with his advance, what made the face dim with a pair of raised hands that covered it, and in which, so far from being offered in defiance, it were buried as for the dark depreciation. So Braden, before him, took him in, with every fact of him now, in the eye of the light, hard and acute. His bland stillness, his vivid truth, his gravelled bent head and white mask and hands, his queer actuality of evening dress, the dangling double eyeglasses, a gleaming silk lapper and white linen, with pearl button and gold watchguard and polished shoe. No portrait by a great modern master could have presented him with more intensity, thrust him out of his frame with more art, as if there had been treatment of the consummate sort in his every shade and salience. The revulsion, for our friend, had become, before his eyes, he knew it, immense. This drop, in the act of apprehension, was a sense of his adversary's inscrutable manoeuvre. That meaning, at least, while he gaped, he offered him, for he could but gape at his other self and the other anguish. Gape as a proof that he, standing there for the achieved, the enjoyed, the triumphant life, couldn't be faced in his triumph. Weren't the truth in the splendid covering hands, strong and completely spread, so spread and so intentional that, in spite of a special verity that surpassed every other, the fact that one of these hands had lost 2 fingers, which were reduced to stumps as if accidentally shot away, the face were effectually guarded and saved. Saved? Oh, would it be? Braden breathed his wonder, and the very impunity of his attitude, and the very instant of his eyes produced, as he felt, a sudden stir which showed the next instant as a deeper portent. while the head raised itself, the betrayal of a braver purpose. The hands, as he looked, began to move, to open then as if deciding in a flash, dropped from the face and left it uncovered, and presented. Horror of the sight had leapt in the bride's throat, gasping there in a sound he couldn't utter, for the bared identity was too hideous as his, and his glare with the passion of his protest. The face, that face, Spencer Bryden's. He searched it still, looking away from it in dismay and denial, falling straight from his height of sublimity. It were unknown, inconceivable, awful, disconnected from any possibility. He had been sold, he inwardly moaned, stalking such a game as this. Present before him was a presence, the horror within him an horror, but the waste of his nights had only been a grotesque, or had been only grotesque, and the success of his venture an irony. Such an identity fitted his at no point, made its alternative monstrous. 1,000 times yes, as it come upon him nearer now, the face with the face of a stranger. It come upon him nearer now, quite as one of those expanding fantastic images projected by the magic lantern of childhood. The stranger, whoever he might be, evil, odious, blatant, vulgar, and advanced as for aggression, and he knew himself give ground, then harder press still, sit with the force of his shock, and fallen back as under a hot breath, and the roused passion of his the roused passion of a laugh larger than his own, a rage of personality before which his own collapsed. He felt the old version turn to darkness, and his very feet give way. His head went round. He were going. He had gone. That's the end of part 2. I'll have a quick swallow of water before we press on. So often it is that we seek to find ourselves. But more often than that even, is it that when we find ourselves we are disappointed at best and horrified at worst. A foolish thing to seek out. 3. What had next brought him back clearly, though after how long, was Mrs. Muldoon's voice, coming to him from quite near, from so near that he seemed presently to see her as kneeling on the ground before him, while he lay looking up at her, himself not wholly on the ground, but half raised and upheld, conscious, yes, of tenderness and support, and more particularly of an head pillowed in extraordinary softness and a faintly refreshing fragrance. He considered, he wondered, his wit but half at his services. Then another face intervened, bending more directly over him. Yeah. Okay. Then another face intervened, bending more directly over him, and he finally knew that Alice Stavison had made her lap an ample and perfect cushion to him, and that she had to this end seated herself on the lowest degree of the staircase, the rest of his long person remaining stretched on his old black and white slabs. They was cold, these marble squares of his youth, but he somehow were not, in this rich return of consciousness, the most wonderful hour, little by little, that he had ever known, leaving him as it did, so gratefully, so abysmally passive, and yet as with a treasure of intelligence waiting all round him, with quiet appropriation. Dissolved, you might call it, in the air of the place, and producing the golden glow of a late autumn afternoon. He had come back, yes, come back from farther away than any man but himself had ever travelled. It was strange how, in a sense, what he had come back to seemed really the great thing, and as if his prodigious journey had been all for the sake of it. Slowly but surely his consciousness grew, his visions of his state as complete in itself. He had been miraculously carried back, lifted and carefully borne as from where he had been picked up, the uttermost end of an interminable great passage. Even with this he was suffered the rest, and what had now brought him the knowledge with a break in the long mild motion. He had brought him the knowledge, yes, this was the beauty of the state, which come to resemble more and more that of a man who has gone to sleep on some news of great inheritance, and then, after dreaming it away, after profaning it with matters strange to it, has woken up again the serenity of certitude, and has now only to lie and watch it grow. This was the drift of his patience. He had only to let it shine on him. He must, moreover, within intermissions, still have been lifted and borne, since why and how else should he have known himself later on, with the afternoon glow intenser, no longer at the foot of his stairs, situated as he's now seemed at the dark other end of his tunnel, but on a deep window beneath of his high saloon, over which has been spread, couch fashion, a mantle of soft stuff lined with grey fur that were familiar to his eyes, that one of his hands kept fondly feeling as for its pledge of truth. Mrs. Muldoon's face had gone, but the other, the second he had recognised, hung over him, in a way that showed how he was still propped and pillowed. He took it all in, and the more he took it in, the more it seemed to suffice. He was as much at peace as if he had food and drink. It were the two women who had found him, on Miss Muldoon's having plied at her usual hour a latchkey, and on her having above all arrived while Mrs. Stavison still lingered near the house. She had been turning away, all anxiety, for worrying the vain bellhandle, a calculation having been of the hour of the good woman's visit. But the latter, blessedly, had come up while she was still there. They had entered together. He had then lain beyond the vestibule, very much as he were lying now, quiet that is, as he appeared to have fallen, but also wondrously without bruise or gash, only in a depth of stupor. What he most took in, however, at present, with a steadier clearance, that Alice Stavison had for a long unspeakable moment not doubted he were dead. It must have been that I was. He made it out as she held him. Yes, I can only have died. He brought me literally to life. Only, he wondered, his eyes rising low, only in the name of all the benedictions, how? It took about an instant to bend her face and kiss him, and something in the manner of it, the way her hands clasped and locked his head, while he felt the cool charity and virtue of her lips. Something in all this beatitude somehow answered everything. And now I keep you, she said. Ah, keep me, he pleaded, while her face still hung over him. In response to which, it dropped again and stayed close, clingingly close. It was the seal of their situation, of which he tasted the impress for a long, blissful moment in silence. He come back. How did you know? I was uneasy. You would have come, you remember, and you had sent no word. Yes, I remember. I would have gone to you at one today. You caught on their the laughing relation, which were so near and so far. I was still out there in my strange darkness, where it was, what were it? I must have stayed there so long. You could but wonder at the depth and the duration of his swoon. Since last night, she asked, with a shade of fear in her possible indiscretion. Since this morning. It must have been the cold dim dawn of today. Where have I been? He vaguely wailed. Where have I been? He felt her hold him close, and it was as if this helped him to now make all insecurity his mild moan. What a long, dark day. All in her tenderness she had waited a moment. In the cold dim dawn, she quavered. But he had already gone on piecing together the parts of the old prodigy. As I didn't turn up, you come straight. She barely cast about. I went at first to your hotel. When they told me of your absence, you had dined out last evening and hadn't been back since. They appeared to know you had been at your club. So you had the idea of this. Of what? She asked in a moment. Well, of what has happened. I believe at least you'd have been here. I've known all along, she said. You've been coming. Known it? Well, I've believed it. I said nothing to you after that talk we had a month ago. But I felt sure. I knew you would, she declared. I persist, you mean? That you'd see him? Ah, but I didn't, cried Bryden with his long wail. There's somebody, an awful beast, whom I brought so horribly to bay. But it's not me. At this she bent over him again, and her eyes were in his eyes. No, it's not you. And it were as if, while her face hovered, he might have made out in it, hadn't it been so near, some particular meaning, blurred by a smile. No, thank heaven, she repeated. It's not you. Of course it wasn't to have been. Ah, but it was, he gently insisted. And he stared before him now, as if he had been staring for so many weeks, or as he had been staring for so many weeks. I was to have known myself. You couldn't, she returned consolingly. and then reverting, and as if to account further for what she had herself done. It wasn't only that. When you hadn't been home, she went on, I waited till the hour at which we had found Miss Muldoon that day of my going with you, and she arrived, as I've told you, while failing to bring anyone to the door. I lingered in my despair on the steps. After a little, if she hadn't come, by such mercy I should have found means to hunt her up. But it wasn't, said Alice Stavern, as if once more with her fine intention. It wasn't only that. His eyes, as he lay, turned back to her. What more then? She met it, the wonder she had stirred. In the cold dim dawn, you say? Well, in the cold dim dawn of this morning, I too saw you. Saw me, saw him, said Alice Stavern. It must have been at the same moment. He lay an instant taking it in, as if he had wished to be quite reasonable. At the same moment? Yes, in my dream again, the same one I've named to you. It came back to me. Then I knew it for a sign. He had come to you. And this Braden raised himself. He had to see her better. She helped him when she understood his movement, and he sat up, steadying himself beside her there on the window bench, with his right hand grasping her left. He didn't come to me. You came to yourself, she beautifully smiled. Ah, I've come to myself now, thanks to you, dearest. This brute with his awful face, this brute's a black stranger. He's none of me, even as I might have been, Braden sturdily declared. But she kept the clearness that were like the breath of infallibility. Isn't the whole point that you'd have been different? He almost scowled. As different as that? Her look again were more beautiful to him than the things of this world. Haven't you exactly wanted to know how different? So this morning, she said, you appeared to me. Like him. A black stranger. Then how did you know it were I? Because, as I told you weeks ago, my mind, my imagination, had worked so over what you mightn't have been. To show you, you see, how I've thought of you. In the midst of that you came to me, and my wonder might be answered. So I knew, she went on, and believed that since the question held to you so fast, as you told me that day, you too would see to yourself. And when this morning I again saw, I knew it would be because you had, and also then, from the first moment, because you somehow wanted me. He seemed to tell me of that. So why, she strangely smiled, shouldn't I like him? It brought Spencer Braden to his feet. You like that horror? I could have liked him. And to me, she said, he was no horror. I had accepted him. Accepted? Braden oddly sounded. Before, for the interest of his difference, yes. That I didn't disown him, as I knew him, that you at last, confronted with him in his difference, so cruelly didn't, my dear. Well, he must have been, you see, less dreadful to me. And it may have pleased him that I pitied him. She was beside him on her feet, though still holding his hand, still with her arms supporting him. But though it all brought for him thus a dim light, you pitied him, he grudgingly, resentfully asked. He has been unhappy. He has been ravaged, she said. And haven't I been unhappy? Am not I? You've only to look at me, ravaged. Ah, I didn't say I like him better, she grunted after a thought. He's grim, he's worn, and things have happened to him. He doesn't make shift for sight with your charming monocle. No, it struck Brad. I couldn't have sported mine. Downtown, they'd have guarded me there. His great convex pince-nez. I saw it. I recognised the kind. It's for his poor ruined sight, and his poor right hand. Ah, Braden winced. Whether for his proved identity, for his lost fingers. Then, he has $1 million a year, he lucidly added. But he hasn't you. And he isn't. No, he isn't you, she murmured, as he drew her to his breast. And that's the end of the Jolly Corner. Well, what do you know? The error of the self, and being what we are not, resolves to remind us of the pleasures of what we actually are. That's nice, isn't it? A happier ending than I were anticipating, I must admit. quite enjoyed that. What we do then, let's have a quick swallow of water and do a little bit of thinking over. So, before we move on to the romance of certain old clothes, let's talk about the Jolly Corner. Now, obviously, it is at once, well, I was about to say obviously and then say something about very confusing, but it strikes me pretty clearly that this is at once much more and much less of a ghost story than Owen Wingrave. Much more because a lot more of the text is taken up with the importance of ghosts. The man who is haunted, the time spent in the house, the apparition, the figure, all these things. So much of it is, the focus of the story, to the extent that much more, I think, than Owen Wingrave, it deserves to be called a ghost story. For Owen Wingrave, for all that it is a story about a man who ends with a ghost, only really tangentially contains the point. It isn't really central to the piece. Whereas in this one it is. At the same time, it is less of a ghost story because while Owen Wingrave has an actual ghost, an ancestral figure, someone who died and come out and is now inside the property and causing the haunting, the only ghost here is the ghost of a person who might have been. Another version of the man haunted. There is no actual spectre of death, only the spectre of a life that might have been. An hard life, a cruel life, a successful life, certainly, but a life significantly less happy than the one currently lived. It's an odd little paradox, that. More and less of a ghost story. Though ultimately I think I would argue more in favour of this being a ghost story overall than the other. Still. What else is there to be said about it? I don't know, really. I feel like I should have more to say about it, but I just don't, really. I mean, I guess I should talk about the love aspect to it. I mean, it's very fairy tale in the ending, True love's kiss to bring one back. And it feels almost eldritch, almost Lovecraftian, is talking about being away in that dark place of being dead. Like someone who has seen something his mind cannot comprehend and lost himself. I do not think Lovecraft generally allows one to come back to true love's kiss. So maybe a little more fantastical than that. But yeah, it's an odd one too. It's another one of those ones where a lot of the text is taken up not in actual action, but in description, in narrative and feeling. And given how long it took us, that was an hour and 45 minutes there. Or probably more like an hour and a half of actual reading, I suppose. But there's not a lot actually happens, really. He talks with this person, he tours the house, he spends time in the house. And he has his faint fit and he's woken up. But the depth and the detail of it is in the moments and the writing. I've talked sometimes before about the voice of an author. I think especially when I was reading Twain, I talked quite a lot about it. And in that, I really think Henry James is quite standout there. Like, I liked M.R. James, I still do, but Henry James has this very strong voice. You have a couple of little features you can see, like the repetition of things, like 1, 2, 3, 4 of, the blank, the blank, the blank, the blank, to give emphasis, these different synonyms. Which, I mean, it's a bit of a heavy-handed trick, but it does add to something. He's definitely got a way of building around him this, this atmosphere, I suppose. And that's really what this book is, or what it lives on more than anything. It's all atmosphere. So yeah, I think overall I quite enjoyed it. It's one of those ones that is a strange one, though, I think. Not necessarily one I'd recommend to people, because it's not an easy one to get into. And I definitely felt a bit out of sorts at parts reading it. It's very sort of strange and compelling text. But I did enjoy it. That said, I'll still press on with the romance of certain old clothes, I think, but I don't think we'll get to the ghostly rent of the night. I don't know what about it. It's a good one, I enjoyed it. It's not taxing in that way. But it isn't an easy read either. You know what I mean? Thank you kindly, Abbott. Yeah, good idea. I shall have a lovely drink before we get on. Your health. Yeah. Oh yeah, but it's not. They're not easy reads of the Henry Jameses. I'm not sure why. Like, it's not that it's like I say. Sometimes I find a text hard to read because it's bad. Like with some with run-on sentences or others that we've read, or just that they're frustrating. And this one's not. It's a good one. It's even compelling, and it's not even particularly hard to read in the sentence structure. It's well written enough that it flows well. But something about it really kind of draws me in a way that makes it. I guess that's what I'd say about it. Really, it's intense. It takes a lot to read out of you because it demands your full attention. I found that during that, especially during the latter parts of it, I was struggling more than I normally do to keep an eye on chat. I was feeling more and more pulled into it. That's interesting, really. But yeah, I think Henry James is less casually approachable than his old M.R. James. But I do think there's something to it. Or something to him, I should say. A sort of weight to it. I do think I enjoy it. Now, let's move on to another one so that it can immediately disappoint me and I can reject and recant all of what I have said. Or, you know, have it be proved, you never know. I suppose there's a small possibility of that. The ad break's coming on in a couple of minutes, but I don't have enough to talk about the hold off, so we'll get through a page or two. Yeah. If you're all sitting comfortably, I shall begin. The Romance of Certain Old Clothes. Toward the middle of the 18th century, there lived in the province of Massachusetts a widowed gentlewoman, the mother of 3 children. Her name was of little account. I shall take the liberty of calling her Miss Willoughby, a name, like her own, of an highly respectable sound. She had been left a widow after some 6 years of marriage, and had devoted herself to the care of her progeny. These young persons grew up in a manner to reward her zeal and to gratify her fondest hopes. The firstborn were a son, whom she had called Bernard after his father. The others were daughters, born at an interval of 3 years apart. Good looks was traditional in the family, and this useful trio were not likely to allow the tradition to perish. The boy were that fair and ruddy complexion, and that athletic mould, which in those days, as in these, were the sign of genuine English blood. A frank, affectionate young fellow, a deferential son, a patronising brother, and a steadfast friend. Clever, however, he were not. The wit of the family had been apportioned chiefly to his sisters. Mr. Willoughby had been a great reader of Shakespeare, at a time when this pursuit implied more liberality of taste than at the present day, and in a community where it required much courage to patronise the drama, even in the closet. He had wished to record his admiration of the great poet by calling his daughters out of his favourite plays. Upon the elder he had bestowed the romantic name of Viola, and upon the younger the more serious one of Perdita, in memory of a little girl born between them who had lived but a few weeks. When Bernard Willoughby came to his 16th year, his mother put a brave face upon it, and prepared to execute her husband's last request. This had been an earnest entreaty that, at the proper age, his son should be sent out to England to complete his education at the University of Oxford, which had been the seat of his own studies. Mrs. Willoughby fancied that the lad's equal were not to be found in the 2 hemispheres, that she had the antique wifely submissiveness. She swallowed her subs, and made up her boy's trunk and his simple provincial outfit, and sent him on his way across the seas. Bernard was entered at his father's college, and spent 5 years in England, without great honour indeed, but with a vast deal of pleasure, and no discredit. On leaving the university, he made his journey to France. In his 23rd year he took ship for Rome, prepared to find poor little New England. New England were very small in those days, an utterly intolerable place of abode. But there had been changes at home, as well as in Mr. Bernard's opinions. He found his mother's house quite habitable, and his sisters grown into 2 very charming young ladies, with all the accomplishments and graces of the young women of Britain, and a certain native-grown gentle brusquerie and wildness which, if it were not an accomplishment, was certainly a grace the more. Bernard privately assured his mother that his sisters were fully a match for the most genteel young women in England, whereupon poor Miss Willoughby, you may be sure, bade them hold up their heads. Such were Bernard's opinion, and such, in tenfold higher degree, were the opinion of Mr. Arthur Lloyd. This gentleman, I hasten to add, were a college mate of Mr. Bernard, a young man of reputable family, of a good person and handsome inheritance, which latter appurtenance he proposed to invest and trade in this country. He and Bernard were warm friends. They had crossed the ocean together, and the young American had lost no time in presenting him at his mother's house, where he had made quite a good impression as that which he had received, and of which I had just given him. The two sisters was, at this time, all in their freshness of youthful bloom, each wearing, of course, this natural brilliancy in the manner that become her best. They was equally dissimilar in appearance and character. Viola, the elder, now in her 22nd year, were tall and fair, with calm grey eyes and auburn tresses. A very faint likeness to the Viola of Shakespeare's comedy, whom I imagine as a brunette, if you will, but a slender, airy creature full of the softest and finest emotions. Miss Willoughby, with her candid complexion, her fine arms, a majestic heart, and her slow utterances, were not cut out for adventures. She would never have put on a man's jacket and hose, and indeed, being a very plump beauty, it is perhaps as well that she would not. Perdita, too, might very well have exchanged the sweet melancholy of her name against something more in consonance with her aspect and disposition. She was a positive brunette, short of stature, light of foot, with vivid dark brown eyes. She had been from her childhood a creature of smiles and gaiety, and so far from making you wait for an answer to your speech, as your handsome sister would want to do, while she gazed at you with her somewhat cold grey eyes. She had given you the choice of half a dozen, suggested by the successive clauses of your proposition before you had got the end of it. And I pause there for a moment because the ad break is about to come on. Now while that plays, let's have a little thought. So first things first, what strikes me about this is, or at least immediately, is that the opening especially is very fairy tale, right? But not necessarily in the content of it, obviously it's a bit more modern than your average fairy tale, but in the way it's structured. Old widow woman lives in the sort of a rural area, 3 children, son who is, the peak of their and all these virtues. And even then, in the introduction of the young women, it does come across very fairy tale, The one who is like this and the other who is like this. I mean, obviously a proper fairy tale would have had 3 young women, generally speaking, at least in the traditional sense, but yeah. It gives a real strong impression of that sort, to my mind at least. Obviously, it's a bit more modern than your average fairy tale. The going across to Oxford University in England, being not commonly found in fairy tales. Well, I guess you could see it as a more modern variation of some sort of going off to study, Well, I guess, yeah, it's just a more specific version of something that does happen in fairy tales, Going off to learn things or make one's fortune or otherwise come into the world. Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think what else there is to say, really. I mean, it does strike me as very kind of readable too. It's a very different voice than the last one we read. This one actually, I was just complaining that the first one felt a bit heavy and sort of not entrapping, I guess engrossing, that's the word I'm looking for. And this one it's still got like a good rhythm to it and readability, but the fairy tale tone does make it feel lighter. Well, I say that we're like 2 pages in. Maybe I should hold off judgment on that point. But yeah. And it is building the trappings of like a typical fairy tale story. You have the brother and the 2 sisters, and you have the brother's friend who is a fine man with a high inheritance, and obviously I suspect there's going to be some sort of competition between the 2 sisters for the hand of this. And the Shakespearean names are a nice touch, especially the whole names sort of go against the character slightly. And they're not in the way, they're introduced as a romantic and a sort of mournful name. And in the same way, they're shown to be against their name, but not in the way of being opposites, right? The first sister's not sorrowful, she's just a little bit taciturn and, what's the term? Not hardbound. Sedentary? She's not built for adventure, sort of thing. Whereas the other one is very joyful and very happy to her sorrow, which I guess is a more direct counterpart. I don't know. Yeah, it is a direct counterpart to her own name, but it's not the name of her sister. It is just another opposition. It's interesting. I like the way it's going. I'm gonna have a quick swallow of water now before the ads end. And that's us back. So let's press on. Young guards
This is the alchemical symbol for earth, the element of the fundament and stability. It is the underlying elemental symbol responsible for the stabilization of most workings, and from which emerge most principal elements. It is synonymous with the solid state of matter.
On with it. What? Sorry, was there just I feel like something happened there. I blinked to miss something. Oh, Nasky, you redeemed another occult secret. That's two of them in your name. Well, I appreciate you coming by enough to get them, and I appreciate you having the dedication too. I'm going to yell at Lamp for a moment here for making me stop in time while he talks to you and teaches you magic, which he still won't teach me. But still, congratulations. I hope that whatever secret you got was a good one. Yeah, I feel like I should say something about that, but again, given that I'm not allowed to know these secrets and didn't get to see it, I don't really know what I can say about it. Other than once again yell at Lamp for not teaching me magic, which feels unfair. Still, I hope it were a good one. I guess all I can really do is press on. The young guards was very glad to see their brother once more, and they found themselves quite able to maintain a reserve of goodwill for their brother's friend. Among the young men, their friends and neighbours, the belle jeunesse of the colony, there was many excellent fellows, several devoted swains, and some two or three who enjoyed the reputation of universal charmers and conquerors. But the homebred arts and the somewhat boisterous gallantry of those honest young colonists were completely eclipsed by the good looks, the fine clothes, the punctilious courtesy, the perfect elegance, the immense information of Mr. Arthur Lloyd. Just going to pause there for a moment to say that, like I mentioned before, that Henry James does a lot of the da. That's what I mean. Like he does lists of things that all kind of add up to give the impression. And Mr. Arthur Lloyd, he were in reality no paragon. He were an honest, resolute, intelligent young man, rich in pounds sterling, in his health and comfortable hopes, and his little capital of uninvested affections. But he were a gentleman. He had an handsome face, he had studied and travelled, he spoke French, he played on the flute, and he read verses aloud with very great taste. There are a dozen reasons why Miss Willoughby and her sister should forthwith have been rendered fastidious in the choice of their male acquaintance. The imagination of woman is especially adapted to various small conventions and mysteries of polite society. Mr. Lloyd's talk told our little New England maidens a vast deal more of the ways and means of people for fashion in European capitals than he had any idea of doing. It was delightful to sit by and hear him and Bernard discourse upon the fine people and fine things they had seen. They would all go around the fire after tea in the little wainscoted parlour, quite innocent then of any intention of being picturesque, or being anything else, indeed, than economical, and saving an outlay in stamped papers and tapestries. The two young men.
Exotic_crab has been bound to the library.
Oh, thank you kindly, exotic crab. I appreciate you following me. That one means follow. I didn't set up those alerts, Ant did, but thank you kindly. I appreciate it. The two young men will remind each other, across the road, of this, that, and the other adventure. Viola and Perdita would often have given their ears to know exactly what adventure it were, and where it happened, and who were there, and what the ladies had on. In those days, a well-bred young woman was not expected to break into the conversation of her own movement, or to ask too many questions. And the poor girl was used, therefore, to sit fluttering behind the more languid, or more discreet, curiosity of their mother. They were both very fine girls, Arthur Lloyd were not slow to discover. It took him some time to satisfy himself as to the apportionment of their charms. He had a strong presentiment, an emotion of nature entirely too cheerful to be called a foreboding, that he was destined to marry one of them. He were unable to arrive at a preference, and for such a consummation, a preference was certainly indispensable, inasmuch as Lloyd were quite too gallant a fellow to make a choice by lot and be cheated of the heavenly delight of falling in love. He resolved to take things easily and let his heart speak. Meanwhile, he were on a very pleasant footing. Mrs. Willoughby showed a dignified indifference to his intentions, equally remote from a carelessness of her daughter's honour, and from the odious hilarity to make him commit himself, which, in his quality of a young man of property, he but too often encountered in the venerable dames of his native islands. As for Bernard, all that he asked was that his friends should take his sisters as his own, and as for the poor girls themselves, however each may have secretly longed for the monopoly of Mr. Lord's attentions, they observed a very decent and modest and contented demeanour. Towards each other, however, they were somewhat more on the offensive. They was good sisterly friends, betwixt whom it would take more than a day for the seeds of jealousy to sprout and bear fruit. But the young girls felt that the seeds had been sown on the day that Mr. Lord come into the house. Each made up her mind that, if she should be slighted, she would bear her grief in silence, and that no one should be any the wiser for it. For if they had a great deal of love, they had also a great deal of pride. Each prayed in secret, nevertheless, that upon her the glory might fall. They had need of a vast deal of patience, a self-control, and a dissimulation. In those days, a young girl of decent breeding could make no advances whatever, and barely responded, indeed, to those that were made. She was expected to sit still in her chair, with her eyes on the carpet, watching the spot where the mystic handkerchief should fall. Poor Arthur Lloyd were obliged to undertake his wooing in the little wainscoted parlour, before the eyes of Mrs. Willoughby, her son, and his prospective sister-in-law. But youth and love are so cunning that 100 signs and tokens might travel to and fro, and not one of these 3 pairs of eyes detect them in their passage. The young girls had but one chamber and one bed between them, and for long hours together they were under each other's direct inspection. They each knew that she were being watched, however, made not a grain of difference in those little offices which they were mutually rendered, or in the various household tasks which they performed in common. Neither flinched nor fluttered beneath the silent batteries of her sister's eyes. The only apparent change in their habits was that they had less to say to each other. It were impossible to talk about Mr. Lloyd, and it were ridiculous to talk about anything else. By tacit agreement, they began to wear all their choice finery, and devise such little implements of coquetry. It's the same root as coquettish, but it's conjugated into with a Y, not etc. And devise such little implements of coquetry in the way of ribbons and top knots and furbelows as was sanctioned by indubitable modesty. They executed in the same inarticulate fashion an agreement and sincerity on these delicate matters. "Is it better so?" Viola would ask, tying a bunch of ribbons on her bosom, and turning about from her glass to her sister. Perdita would look up gravely from her work and examine the decoration. "I think you had better give it another loop," she would say, with great solemnity, looking hard at her sister with eyes that added, "Upon my honour." So they was forever stitching and trimming their petticoats, and pressing out their muslins, and contriving washes and ointments, and cosmetics, like the ladies in the household of the Vicar of Wakefield. Some 3 or 4 months went by. It grew to be midwinter, and, as yet, Viola knew that if Perdita had nothing more to boast of than she, there were not much to be feared from her rivalry. But Perdita, by this time, the charming Perdita, felt that her secret had grown to be tenfold more precious than her sister's. One afternoon, Miss Willoughby sat alone before her toilet glass, combing out her long hair. It was getting too dark to see. She lit the 2 candles in their sockets on the frame of her mirror, and then went to the window to draw the curtains. It was a grey December evening. The landscape was bare and bleak, the sky heavy with snow clouds. At the end of the long garden into which the windows looked were a wall with a little postern door, opening into a lane. The door stood ajar, as she could vaguely see in the gathering darkness, and moved slowly to and fro, as if someone were swaying it from the lane without. It was doubtless a servant maid. But as she were about to drop her curtain, Viola saw her sister step within the garden and hurry along the path towards the house. She dropped the curtain, all save a little crevice for her eyes. As Perdita come up the path, she seemed to be examining something in her hand, holding it close to her eyes. When she reached the house, she stopped a moment, looked intently at the object, and pressed it to her lips. Poor Viola slowly come back to her chair, and sat down before her glass where, if she had looked at it less abstractly, she would have seen her handsome features sadly disfigured by jealousy. A moment afterwards the door opened behind her, and her sister came into the room, out of breath, and her cheeks aglow with the chilly air. Perdita started. "Ah," she said, "I thought you were their mother." The ladies was to go to a tea party, and on such occasions it was the habit of one of the young girls to help their mother to dress. Instead of coming in, Perdita lingered at the door. Come in, said Viola. We've more than an hour yet. I should like you very much to give a few strokes to my hair. She knew her sister wished to retreat, and that she could see in the glass all her movements in the room. Now just help me with my hair, she said, and I'll go to Mamma. Perdita came reluctantly and took the brush. She saw her sister's eyes in the glass, fastened hard upon her hands. She had not made 3 passes when Viola clapped her own right hand upon her sister's left, and started out of her chair. Whose ring is that? She cried passionately, drawing her towards the light. On the young girl's third finger glistened a little gold ring, adorned with a couple of small rubies. Perdita felt that she need no longer keep her secret, that she must put a bold face on her avowal. It's mine, she said proudly. Who gave it to you? Cried the other. Perdita hesitated a moment. Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd is generous all of a sudden. No, cried Perdita with a spirit. Not all of a sudden. He offered it to me a month ago. And you did a month's begging to take it, said Viola, looking at the little trinket, which, indeed, was not especially elegant, although it were the best that the jeweller of the province could furnish. I shouldn't have taken it in less than 2. It isn't the ring, said Perdita. It's what it means. It means that you're not a modest girl, cried Viola. Pray, does your mother know of your conduct? Just burn it. My mother has approved of my conduct, as you call it. Mr. Lloyd has asked my hand, and Mamma has given it. Would you have had him apply to you, sister? Viola gave her sister a long look, full of passionate envy and sorrow. Then she dropped her lashes on her pale cheeks and turned away. Perdita felt that it had not been a pretty scene, but it were her sister's fault. But the elder girl rapidly called back her pride and turned herself about again. You have my very best wishes, she said with a low curtsy. I wish you every happiness and a very long life. Perdita gave a bitter laugh. Don't speak in that tone, she cried. I'd rather you cursed me outright. Come, sister, she added. You couldn't marry both of us. I wish you every great joy, Viola repeated mechanically, sitting down to her glass again, and a very long life, and plenty of children. There was something in the sound of these words, not all to Perdita's taste. Will you give me a year at least? She said. In a year I can have one little boy, or one little girl at least. If you give me your brush again, I'll do your hair. Thank you, said Viola. You'd better go to Mamma. It isn't becoming that a young lady with a promised husband should wait on a girl with none. Nay, said Perdita good-humouredly. I have Arthur to wait upon me. You need my service more than I need yours. But her sister motioned her away, and she left the room. When she had gone, poor Viola fell upon her knees before her dressing table, buried her head in her arms, and poured out a flood of tears and sobs. She felt very much better for this effusion of sorrow. When her sister come back, she insisted upon helping her to dress, and upon her wearing her prettiest things. She forced upon her acceptance of a bit of lace of her own, and declared that now she were to be married, she should do her best to appear worthy of her lover's choice. She discharged these offices in stern silence, but, such as they was, they had to do duty as an apology, and an atonement. She ne'er made any other. Now that Lloyd were received by the family as an accepted suitor, nothing remained but to fix the wedding day. We were appointed for the following April, and in the interval, preparations was diligently made for the marriage. Lord and his Tsar were busy with his commercial arrangements, and were establishing a correspondence with the great mercantile houses to which he had attached himself in England. He were therefore not so frequent a visitor of Mrs. Willoughby's as during the months of his diffidence and irresolution, and poor Viola had less to suffer than she had feared from the sight of the mutual endearments of the young lovers. Touching his future sister-in-law, Lloyd had a perfectly clear conscience. There had not been a particle of sentiment uttered between them, and he had not the slightest suspicion that she coveted anything more than his fraternal regard. He were quite at his ease. Life promised so well, both domestically and financially. The lurid clouds of revolution were as yet 20 years beneath the horizon, and that his connubial felicity should take a tragic turn, it were absurd, it were blasphemous to apprehend. Meanwhile, at Miss Willoughby's, there were a greater rustling of silks, a more rapid clicking of scissors and flying of needles than ever. Mrs. Willoughby had determined that her daughter should carry from the home the most elegant outfit that her money could buy, and that the country could furnish. All the sage women in the country were convened, and their united tastes were brought to bear on Perdita's wardrobe. Viola's situation at this moment were assuredly not to be envied. The poor girl had an inordinate love of dress, and the very best taste in the world, as her sister perfectly well knew. Viola was tall, she was stately and sweeping, she was made to carry stiff brocade and masses of heavy lace, such as belonged to the toilet of a rich man's wife. But Viola sat aloof, with her beautiful arms folded and her head averted, while her mother and sister and the venerable women aforesaid worried and wondered over the materials, oppressed by the multitude of their resources. One day there came in a beautiful piece of white silk, brocaded with celestial blue and silver, sent by the bridegroom himself, it not being thought amiss in those days that the husband-elect should contribute to the bride's trousseau. Perdita were quite at a loss to imagine a fashion which should do sufficient honour to the splendour of the material. "Blue's your colour, sister, more than mine," she said with appealing eyes. "It's a pity it's not for you. You'd know what to do with it." Viola got up from her place and looked at the great shining fabric as it lay spread over the back of the chair. Then she took it up in her hands and felt it, lovingly as Perdita could see, and turned about towards the mirror with it. She let it roll down to her feet and flung the other end over her shoulder, gathering it about her waist with her white arms bare to the elbow. She threw back her head and looked at her image, and an hanging tress of her auburn hair fell upon the gorgeous surface of the silk. It made a dazzling picture, the women standing about like the little of admiration. "Yes, indeed," said Viola quietly. "Blue is my colour." But Perdita could see that her fancy had been stirred, and that she would now fall to work and solve all their silken riddles. And indeed, she behaved very well, as Perdita, knowing her insatiable love of millinery, were quite ready to declare. Innumerable yards of lustrous silk and satin, of muslin, velvet, and lace passed through their cunning hands without a word of envy coming from her lips. Thanks to her industry, when the wedding day came, Perdita were prepared to espouse more of the vanities of life than any fluttering young bride who as yet challenged the sacramental blessing of a New England divine. It had been arranged that the young couple should go out and spend the first days of their wedded life at the country house of an English gentleman, a man of rank and a very kind friend to Lloyd. He was an unmarried man. He professed himself delighted to withdraw and leave them for a week to their billing and cooing. After the ceremony at church, it had been performed by an English parson, young Mrs. Lloyd hastened back to her mother's house to change her wedding gear for a riding dress. Viola helped her to effect the change in the little old room which they had been fond sisters together. Perdita then hurried off to bid farewell to her mother, leaving Viola to follow. The parting was short. The horses was at the door and Arthur impatient to start. But Viola had not followed, and Perdita hastened back to her room, opening the door abruptly. Viola, as usual, before the glass, in a position which caused the others to stand still, amazed. She had dressed herself in Perdita's cast-off wedding veil and wreath, and on her neck she had hung the heavy string of pearls which the young girl had received from her husband as a wedding gift. These things had been hastily laid aside to await their possessor's disposal on her return from the country. Bedizened but in this unnatural garb, Viola stood at the mirror, plunging a long look into its depths, and reading heaven knows what audacious visions. Perdita were horrified. Here an hideous image of their old rivalry had come to life again. She made a step towards her sister, as if to pull off the veil and the flowers, but catching her eyes in the glass, she stopped. "Farewell, Viola," she said. "You might at least have waited till I had got out of the house." And she hurried from the room. Mr. Lloyd had purchased in Boston a house which, in the taste of those days, was considered a marvel of elegance and comfort, and here he very soon established himself with his young wife. He was thus separated by a distance of 20 miles from the residence of his mother-in-law. 20 miles in that primitive era of roads and conveyances was a serious matter, as a hundred in the present day, and Mrs. Willoughby saw but little of her daughter during the first 12 months of their marriage. She suffered in no small degree from her absence, and her affliction was not diminished by the fact that Viola had fallen into terribly low spirits, and were not to be roused or cheered but by a change of air and circumstances. The real cause of the young girl's dejection the reader will not be slow to suspect. Mrs. Willoughby and her gossips, however, deemed her complaint a purely physical one, and doubted not that she would obtain relief from the remedy just mentioned. The mother accordingly proposed on her behalf a visit to certain relatives on the paternal side established in New York, who had long complained that they were able to see so little of their New England cousins, Viola was dispatched to these good people under a suitable escort and remained with them for several months. In the interval, her brother Bernard, who had begun the practice of law, made up his mind to take a wife. Viola came home to the wedding, apparently cured of her heartache, with honest roses and lilies in her face and a proud smile on her lips. Arthur Lloyd came over to Boston to see his brother-in-law married, but without his wife, who were expecting shortly to present him with an heir. It was nearly a year since Viola had seen him. She was glad, she hardly knew why, that Perdita had stayed at home. Arthur looked happy. He was more grave and solemn than before his marriage. She thought he looked interesting, for although the word, in its modern sense, were not then invented, we may be sure that the idea were. The truth is, he was simply preoccupied with his wife's condition. Nevertheless, he by no means failed to observe Viola's beauty and splendour. Now she quite effaced the poor little bride. The allowance that Perdita had enjoyed for her dress had now been transferred to her sister, who turned it to prodigious account. On the morning after the wedding, he had a lady's saddle put on the horse of the servant who had come with him from town, and went out with the young girl for a ride. It was a keen, clear morning in January. The ground was bare and hard, and the horses in good condition. I say nothing of Viola, who was charming in her hat and plume, and her dark blue riding coat trimmed with fur. They rode all the morning. They lost their way and was obliged to stop for dinner at a farmhouse. The early winter dusk had fallen when they got home. Mrs. Willoughby met them with a long face. A messenger had arrived at noon from Mr. Lloyd. She was beginning to be ill, and desired her husband's immediate return. Sorry, from Mrs. Lloyd. I was worried. She was beginning to be ill and desired her husband's immediate return. The young man, the thought that he had lost several hours, and that by hard riding he might already have been with his wife, had a passionate oath. He barely consented to stop for a mouthful of supper, but mounted the messenger's horse and started off at a gallop. He reached home at midnight. His wife had been delivered of a little girl. Why weren't you with me?" she said as he came to her bedside. "I was out of the house when your man came. I was the Viola," said Lloyd innocently. Mrs. Lloyd made a little moan and turned about, but she continued to do very well, and for a week her improvement was uninterrupted. Finally, however, through some indiscretion in the way of the dire exposure, it was checked, and the poor lady grew rapidly worse. Lloyd was in despair. It very soon became evident that she was breathing her last. Mrs. Lloyd came to a sense of her approaching end and declared that she was reconciled with death. On the third evening after the change took place, she told her husband that she felt she would not outlast the night. She dismissed her servants, and also requested her mother to withdraw, Mrs. Willoughby having arrived on the preceding day. She had her infant placed on the bed beside her, and she lay on her side with the child against her breast, holding her husband's hands. The night lamp was hidden behind the heavy curtains of the bed. The room was illuminated with a red glow, and the immense fire of logs on the hearth. "It seems strange to die by such a fire as that," the young woman said, feebly trying to smile. "If I had but a little of such fire in my veins, but I have given it all for this little spark of mortality." And she dropped her eyes on her child. Then raising them, she looked at her husband with a long penetrating gaze. The last feeling which lingered in her heart was one of mistrust. She had not recovered from the shock which Arthur had given her by telling her that in the hour of her agony he had been with Viola. She trusted her husband very nearly as well as she loved him. Now that she was called away forever, she felt a cold horror of her sister. She felt in her soul that Viola had never ceased to envy her good fortune, and a year of happy security had not effaced the young girl's image, dressed in her wedding garments and smiling with coveted triumph. Now that Arthur would be alone, what might not Viola do? She was beautiful, she was engaging. What arts might not she use? What impression might she not make upon the young man's melancholy heart? Mrs. Lloyd looked at her husband in silence. It seemed hard, after all, to doubt of his constancy. His fine eyes was filled with tears, his face was convulsed with weeping. The clasp of his hands was warm and passionate. How noble he looked, how tender, how faithful and devoted. Nay, thought Perdita, he's not for such as Viola. He'll never forget me. Nor does Viola truly care for him. She cares only for vanities, and finery and jewels. And She dropped her eyes on her white hands, which her husband's liberality had covered with rings, and on the lace ruffles which trimmed the edge of her nightdress. She covets my rings and my laces more than she covets my husband. At this moment, the thought of her sister's rapacity seemed to cast a dark shadow between her and the helpless figure of her little girl. "Arthur," she said, "you must take off my rings. I shall not be buried in them. One of these days my daughter shall wear them, my rings and my laces and silks. I had them all brought out and shown me today. It's a great wardrobe. There's not such another in the province. I can say it without vanity now that I've done it. It will be a great inheritance for my daughter when she grows into a young woman. There are things that a man never... There are things that a man never buys twice, and if they're lost you'll never again see the like. So you'll watch them well. Some dozen things I've left to Viola. I've named them to my lover. I've given her that blue and silver. It was meant for her. I wore it only once. I looked ill in it. But the rest would be be sacredly kept for this little innocent, with such lovely provenance that she should be my colour. She can wear my gowns. She has her mother's eyes. You know the same fashions come back every 20 years. She can wear my gowns as they are. They'll lie there quietly waiting till she grows into them, wrapped in camphor and rose leaves, and keeping their colours in the sweet-scented darkness. She'll have black hair. She'll wear my carnation satin. You promise me, Arthur? Promise you what, dearest? Promise me to keep your poor little wife's old gowns. Are you afraid I'll sell them? No. They might get scattered. My mother will have them properly wrapped up, and you shall lay them away under a double lock. You know the great chest in the attic, with the iron bands? There's no end to what it will hold. You can lay them all there. My mother and the housekeeper will do it, give you the key. And you'll keep the key in your secretary and never give it to anyone but your child. You promise me? Ah, yes, I promise you, said Lloyd, puzzled at the intensity with which his wife appeared to cling to this idea. Will you swear? Repeated Perdita. Yes, I swear. Well, I trust you. I trust you, said the poor lady, looking into his eyes, with eyes which, if he had suspected her vague apprehensions, he might have read an appeal quite as much as an assurance. Lord bore his bereavement soberly and manfully. A month after his wife's death, in the course of commerce, circumstances arose which offered him an opportunity of going to England. He embraced it as a diversion from gloomy thoughts. He was absent nearly a year, during which his little girl was tenderly nursed and cherished by her grandmother. On his return, his house again was thrown open and announced his intention of keeping the same state as during his wife's lifetime. It soon came to be predicted that he would marry again, and there were at least a dozen young women of whom one may say that it would be no further theirs that for 6 months after his return, the prediction did not come true. During this interval, he still left his little daughter in Mrs. Willoughby's hands, the latter assuring him that a change of residence in so tender an age were perilous to her health. Finally, however, he declared that his heart longed for his daughter's presence, and that she must be brought up to town. He sent his coach and his housekeeper to fetch her home. Mrs. Willoughby were in terror lest something should befall her on the road, and in accordance with this feeling, Viola offered to ride along with her. She could return the next day. So she went up to town with her little niece, and Mr. Lloyd met her on the threshold of his house, overcome with her kindness and with gratitude. Instead of returning the next day, Viola stayed out the week, and when at last she reappeared, she had come only for her clothes. Arthur would not hear of her coming home, nor would the baby. She cried and moaned if Viola left her, and at the sight of her grief, Arthur lost his wits, and swore that she would go on to die. In fine, nothing would suit them but that Viola should remain until the poor child had grown used to strange faces. It took 2 months to bring this consummation about, for not until this period had elapsed that Viola took leave of her brother-in-law. Mrs. Willoughby had shaken her head over her daughter's absence. She declared it would not be coming, and that it was the talk of the town. She had reconciled herself to it only because during the young girl's visit the household enjoyed an unwonted term of peace. Bernard Willoughby had brought his wife home to live, between whom and his sister-in-law there existed a bitter hostility. Viola was perhaps no angel, but in the daily practice of life she was a sufficiently good-natured girl, and if she quarrelled with Mrs. Burnett, it was not without provocation. Quarrel, however, she did, to the great annoyance not only of her antagonist, but the two spectators of these constant altercations. Her stay in the household of her brother-in-law, therefore, would have been delightful, if only because it removed her from contact with the object of her antipathy at home. It was 10 times delightful, and then it kept her near the object of her old passion. Mrs. Lord's poignant mistrust had fallen very far short of the truth. Viola's sentiment had been a passion at first, and a passion it remained, a passion of whose radiant heat, tempered to the delicate state of his feeling, Mr. Lord very soon felt the influence. Lord, as I have hinted, was not a modern Petrarch. It was not in his nature to practice an ideal constancy. He had not been many days in the house with his sister-in-law before he began to assure himself that she were, in the language of that day, a devilish fine woman. Whether Viola really practised those insidious arts that her sister had been tempted to impute to her, it is needless to inquire. It is enough to say that she found a means to appear to the very best advantage. She used to seat herself every morning before the great fireplace in the dining room and work upon a piece of tapestry, with her little niece deporting herself on the carpet at her feet, or on the train of her dress, and playing with her woolen balls. Lord would have been a very stupid fellow if he had remained insensible to the rich suggestion of this charming picture. He was prodigiously fond of his little girl, and was never weary of taking her in his arms, and tossing her up and down, and making her crow with delight. Very often, however, he would venture upon a greater liberties than the young lady were yet prepared to allow, and she would suddenly vociferate her displeasure. Viola would then drop her tapestry, put out her handsome hand, with the serious smile of the young girl, whose virgin fancy has revealed to her all her mother's healing arts. Lord would give up the child, their eyes would meet, their hands would touch, and Viola would extinguish the little girl's sobs upon the snowy folds of the kerchief that crossed her bosom. Her dignity were perfect, and nothing could be more discreet than the manner in which she accepted her brother-in-law's hospitality. It may be said almost, perhaps, that there was something harsh in her reserve. Lord had a provoking feeling that she were in the house, and yet she were unapproachable. Half an hour after supper, at the very outset of the long winter evening, she would light her candle, make the young man a most respectful curtsy, and march off to bed. If these was arts, Viola were a great artist. The effect was so gentle, so gradual, they were calculated to work upon the young widower's fancy with such a finely shadowed crescendo that, as the reader has seen several weeks elapsed before, Viola began to feel sure that her return would cover her outlay. When this became morally certain, she packed up her trunk and returned to her mother's house. For 3 days she waited. On the 4th, Mr. Lord made his appearance, a respectful but ardent suitor. Viola heard him out with great humility and accepted him with infinite modesty. It is hard to imagine that Mrs. Lord should have forgiven her husband, but if anything might have disarmed her resentment, it would have been the ceremonious continuance of this interview. Viola imposed upon her lover but a short probation. They was married, as would become him, with great privacy, almost with secrecy, in the hopes that perhaps, as were waggishly remarked at the time, the late Mrs. Lord wouldn't hear of it. The marriage was to all appearance an happy one, and each party obtained what it had desired. Lord, that devilish fine woman, and Viola's desires, as the readers will have observed, have remained a good deal of a mystery. There were, indeed, 2 blots upon their felicity, but time would perhaps efface them. During the first 3 years of her marriage, Mrs. Lord failed to become a mother, and her husband, on his side, suffered heavy losses of money. This latter circumstance compelled a material retrenchment in his expenditure, and Viola was perforce less of a great lady than her sister had been. She contrived, however, to sustain with unbroken consistency the part of an elegant woman, although it must be confessed that it required the exercise of more ingenuity than belongs to your real aristocratic repose. She had long since ascertained that her sister's immense wardrobe had been sequestered for the benefit of her daughter, and that it lay languishing in thankless gloom in the dusty attic. It was a revolting thought that these exquisite fabrics should await the commands of a little girl who sat in an armchair and ate bread and milk with a wooden spoon. Viola had the good taste, however, to say nothing about the matter until several months had expired. Then at last she timidly broached it to her husband. Were it not a pity that so much finery should be lost? For lost it would be, what with the colours fading, and moths eating it up, and the changing of fashions. But Lord gave so abrupt and peremptory a negative to her inquiry that she saw that for the present her attempts were vain. 6 months went by, however, and she brought with them new needs and new fancies. Viola's thoughts hovered lovingly about her sister's relics. She went up and looked at the chest in which they lay imprisoned. There was sullen defiance in its 3 great padlocks, and its iron band, which only quickened her desire. There was something exasperating in its incorruptible immobility. It was like a grim and grizzled old household servant who locks his jaw over a family secret. And then there was the look of capacity in its vast extent, and the sound of dense fullness when Viola knocked on its side with the toe of her little slipper, which caused her to flush with baffled longing. "It's absurd," she cried. "It's improper. It's wicked." And she forthwith resolved upon another attack upon her husband. On the following day, after dinner, when he had had his wine, she bravely begun it, but he cut her short with great sternness. "Once and for all, Viola," he said, "it's out of the question. I shall be gravely displeased if you return to the matter." "Very good," said Viola. "I'm glad to learn the value at which I'm held. Great heaven," she cried. "I'm a happy woman. It's an agreeable thing to feel oneself sacrificed to a caprice." And her eyes filled with tears of anger and disappointment. Lloyd had a good-natured man's horror of a woman's soft. When he attempted, I may say he condescended to explain. "It's not caprice, dear, it's a promise," he said. "An oath. An oath! It's a pretty matter for oaths. And to whom, I pray?" "To Perdita," said the young man, raising his eyes for an instant, but immediately dropping them. "Perdita, Perdita." And Viola's tears broke forth. Her bosom heaved with stormy sobs which was the long-deferred counterpart of the violent fit of weeping in which she had indulged herself on the night when she discovered her sister's betrothal. She had hoped, in her better moments, that she had done with her jealousy, but her temper on that occasion had taken an ineffable fold. "And pray, what right," she cried, "had Perdita to dispose of my future? What right had she but to bind you so to meanness and cruelty? I occupy a dignified place, and I make a very fine figure. I am welcome to what Perdita has left. And what has she left? I never knew till now how little. Nothing, nothing, nothing." This was very poor logic, but with very good passion. Lord put his arm around his wife's waist and tried to kiss her, but she shook him off with magnificent scorn. Poor fellow, he had coveted a devilish fine woman, and he got one. Her scorn were intolerable. He walked away with his ears tingling, irresolute, distracted. Before him were his secretary, and in it the sacred key, which with his own hand he had turned in the triple lock. He marched up and opened it, and took the key from a secret drawer, wrapped in a little packet which he had sealed with his own honest bit of blazonry. "Tenio," said the motto, "I hold." But you were ashamed to put it back. He flung it upon the table beside his wife. "Keep it," she cried. "I want it not. I hate it." "I wash my hands of it," cried her husband. "God forgive me." Mrs. Lloyd gave an indignant shrug of her shoulders and swept out of the room, while the young man retreated by another door. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Lloyd returned and found the room occupied by her little stepdaughter and the nursery maid. The key were not on the table. She glanced at the child. A child was perched on a chair with a packet in her hands. She had broken the seal with her own little fingers. Mrs. Lloyd hastily took possession of the key. At the habitual supper hour, Arthur Lloyd came back from his counting room. It was the month of June, and supper was served by daylight. The meal was placed on the table, but Mrs. Lloyd failed to make her appearance. The servant, whom his master sent to call her, came back with the assurance that her room was empty. The woman informed them that she had not been seen since dinner. They had in truth observed her to have been in tears, and, supposing her to be shut up in her chamber, had not disturbed her. Her husband called her name in various parts of the house, but without response. At last it occurred to him that he might find her by taking the way to the attic. The thought gave him a strange feeling of discomfort, and he bade his servants remain beyond, wishing no witnesses in his quest. He reached the foot of the staircase, leading to the topmost flat, and stood with his hand on the banister, pronouncing his wife's name. His voice trembled. He called again, louder and more firmly. The only sound which disturbed the absolute silence was a faint echo of his own tones, repeating his question under the great eaves. He nevertheless felt irresistibly moved to ascend the staircase. It opened upon a wide hall, lined with wooden closets, and terminating in a window which looked westward, and emitted the last rays of the sun. Before the window stood the great chest. Before the chest, on her knees, the young man saw with amazement and horror the figure of his wife. In an instant he crossed the interval between them, bereft of utterance. The lid of the chest stood open, exposing amid their perfumed napkins its treasure of stuffs and jewels. The yellow had fallen backwards from a kneeling posture, with one hand supporting her on the floor, the other pressed to her heart. On her limbs were the stiffness of death, and on her face, in the fading light of the sun, the terror of something more than death. Her lips were parted in entreaty, in dismay, in agony, and on her bloodless brow and cheeks there glowed the marks of 10 hideous wounds from 2 vengeful, ghostly hands. And that's the end of the romance of certain old clothes. Well then, let us retire a bit to a more comfortable little area to do a little bit of discussion of that, shall we? Well, what can we say about that? A fair few things, I'm sure. First of all, it's pretty clearly said that, well, it's another one of those stories that isn't quite so much a ghost story in most of it. Not dissimilar to Owen Wingrave, but in some ways even more detached from the actual moment of it. I mean, I suppose I should say that, how do you put it? That in the in the death of Perdita, there is an hint towards this ghostiness, this vow made. You're very welcome, Mabbe. I very much appreciate you having been here for it. There's some hint to the coming of the ghost story in the vow made. At the end, in the last moment of it, really the last page is the thing of it. You're very welcome, Tanner. I'm very glad to have had you. But yeah. And the last page is where you really read the ghostly of it. And the rest of it is very much sort of fairy tale in its telling. Not quite in the sort of general outlines. Fairy tales tend to be a little broader, a little less specific. Hearts to you too, Blake. It is, once again, a very strange sort of tale. And again, you do see some of that. Again, it is, I think, with James, I'm beginning to get a sense of all in the ambience, the vibes, the sort of feeling it engenders. It's quite a broad sort of story. You could see this being a fairy tale that you tell in half the time, right? Hey, it's no worry, Tanner. I'm never going to judge you for having a bad day. I've been there far too often. I hope new meds help, and I hope you get good rest and take care of yourself, yeah? Your health is the most important thing. But yeah, it does a lot of the actual outlines of the story do read like a fairy tale. Some that could be told in vaguer terms in a quarter of the time, but yeah. Ah yes, I do provide you with a powerful lamp to attract them, don't I? I feel like I should be judgmental on that fact, but I don't think I have any ground to stand on there. Just, make sure that none of these moths have, like lasting tragedies or significant events that have promised them to other people to eat. Otherwise, you never know what might happen. But yeah. But yeah, a bit of an odd ghost story, that one. I do think I'm liking the Henry Jameses. They're good. They're, again, compelling. He's a very good writer. This one didn't quite draw me in as much as the other one, although I think partly that's just because it didn't have the time to do so. It was a bit more snappy, a bit more quick with its conclusions. But it was a really enjoyable, I do really enjoy them. They are very compelling little stories, and he does a very good job of, I guess, of building characters, right? I mean, I hadn't really thought about it, but now that I think that is actually another thing that he excels at that I haven't really been paying attention to. Because I so much am caught up in the atmosphere and I'm so busy on the story, but every character in that story, aside from maybe the elder Mrs. This is what else? The original surname of the family I've immediately forgotten because I'm an idiot. The mother of the 3 children doesn't really get a lot of billing, although she gets a little. But of the rest of them, you really do get a strong sense of their characters. So, I mean, I think perhaps the least developed is the husband himself, whose name again I've forgotten. But even he, you get the sense that he is light-eyed and, a little concerned, a little bit naive, but still very devoted to his wife, and very, in both cases, to both wives. A man torn apart by the promises of the past and the realities of the present. And of the 2 sisters, you see them sort of grow, and I don't know. I think maybe calling it fairy tale is a little unfair, actually, specifically to the relationship between the two sisters. Because I mean, it is like a very typical thing that jealousy, but about a romance drives two sisters into discord and like fairy tale. But it is seen that it's not a case of like intense hatred and nothingness. It is genuinely that that Viola feels bad, not on account of her sister doing well or being outplayed, but just of the opportunities lost. She still helps her sister, still helps her prepare the dress, still helps her wear everything. But she has overcome her own emotions, and they lead her to, well, actions that later on are significantly more wicked. But yeah, I don't think there's too much else to say about it, really. What am I saying? I was talking about James's characters in general. I should say about the last one, about Jolly Corner, that obviously, I mean, the most developed character in that one is your first one, the gentleman himself. Is it Braden? I remember he had a name that I would today associate with a frat boy douchebag. It seemed a little out of place at the time. But yeah, but he himself was, I mean, God, that thing was basically a character's portrait of the man, right? Even though you didn't see a lot of details on him, it's all him thinking about himself. And the woman of his acquaintance also, despite being very understated and mild and quietly spoken, gets a lot of depth to her as well. And even the housekeeper, who doesn't get a lot of billing at all, you still have a sense of her being, practical, cautious. And Owen Wingrave is also, I mean, it's a portrait of characters now I think about it. The man sending up, Owen Wingrave himself, the man's wife, the sender up's wife, the young man who I gave a French accent, whose name I don't remember because it was quite silly. The lady of the house, all of them get such depth of character, and then the story emerges. And it's only just now occurring to me that I haven't noticed it at all in the reading of it. I have such a strong sense of these characters, and while engaging in the story, I never in one moment really felt like I was learning about them. That's good, actually. Damn, that has snuck up on me. I'm like, that book has kind of taken me by surprise by how good they are in retrospect, and in a way that is so subtle I didn't notice it. I like these Jameses as well. I think I might just like authors whose last name is James. It seems to be a running theme between them. But yeah, I'm almost tempted to go back and do that other one, to do the Ghostly Rental, but it will be 2 more hours of going, and we have been going for almost 3 hours already. And much as my voice is still feeling pretty good, I can feel the beginning to strain, and if I do go on very much longer at all, I shall do myself an injury. So I shan't push on that much. I'll try and even go through the other ones and see if I can find a smaller one. Because I should also be taking time to save on these. But yeah, so I shall move on to my little parting remarks. So, of course, I do thank you all very much for being here. I do genuinely appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed the stories, and I hope that you're all doing well, or if you're not doing well, that you shall be doing well in the near future. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you spending the time to listen to my stories. And I just appreciate you, genuinely and unabashedly. Yeah, it's good advice, Abby. Rest is important. Another thank you to Exotic Crab for the follow partway through, and again to Nask and Plank for hitting your streaks. I very much appreciate it. Yeah. I should be looking at raid now. I'm bad at that. I never really think to it. Is anyone live? I guess Varys is live. I think I read out to Varys. He's playing Paper Mario, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, stick around for that. And if not, I wouldn't, but yeah. Other than that, I do thank you all very much for stopping by. As I've said, I hope that the rest of your day, whatever time it happens to be for you, be it morning, noon, night or otherwise, is pleasant, and I hope that you do well. Yeah, as always, ta-ra.